Okay, welcome everybody to this long-term plans council steering group workshop, which is being recorded, and we do have some apologies from Councillor Batlett, who's on leave, and Councillor Brent, who is otherwise preoccupied. I'm not sure if there's any other apologies. Heath, Councillor Cope, yeah. So just to note those apologies, and I guess welcome everyone, staff, media, and public. Just know we've got quite a lot of things to talk about on the workshop today. Somebody's down for a beer already. I think it's really fitting that we're having this discussion now, because we're really feeling the impact of our community's thoughts and our own experiences as we're consulting on the annual plan. So actually, I think holding the thoughts around what we're hearing now should be quite fundamental to the discussion that we're going to have today. And obviously noting there'll be some more workshops for this long-term plan in the future, but there's not that many of them. I guess what I'm happy to take some guidance on staff, but there's a lot of material which I think most people will have taken as read. I think rather than go through a page by page, what I'd like to see is if we can achieve some sort of discussion about what are the outcomes, because noting there's going to be a review of the rating policies, and we're going to be getting contracts to look at what's happening elsewhere. I think it'd be really good to see if we can, some stage sooner rather than later in this session, talk about the outcomes as councillors that we're wanting to try and achieve in all of this, because a lot of this is what's happening now, and obviously that's likely to change. So I'm not sure who'd be best to maybe think about that, but I'm just keen not to go through page by page, because I think our time is quite limited and precious on that. I'm not sure.
I'd support that, having been through a couple of them before. I'm just aware of how fast the sessions go, and I know we're looking at this in a couple of sessions down the track, but there are all sorts of other things that start to take place in between and get shaped. And so how can we start to have the governance discussions that we need to have to give sufficient direction, rather than waiting until steering group 7 or later. So I just think if we can get to the issue, that would be helpful.
Well, I can suggest then that perhaps the best way through this would be, obviously we have an agenda here, and I think it's really important for the sake of some of the new members around the table to have the opportunity to ask any questions or to understand the aspects that are in here for the long-term plan. But I think if staff can try to keep the presentation components minimal and keep this in mind, that actually will make as much space for discussion as possible, and maybe use then these as little anchor points on which to hang observations and to walk through the process. And if we end up with some time towards the end of the session as well, then that would be of benefit for more general conversation perhaps.
Just we've had quite an induction on things like revenue and financing policy and bits and pieces in the past, so as long as we're not repeating that, and guess maybe we could just frame it as in, okay, for the community funding, this is where we're at, these are the opportunities, what sort of thoughts and guidance, without going through it all in detail.
What would be incredibly helpful perhaps is if you have a sense, John, that actually the table is fully comfortable with the concept that's being discussed, maybe you can indicate we can move past that point. Cool. But we don't want to assume that everybody is at the same attitude in terms of understanding.
Okay, all right, let's see how we go. Right, who's kicking off?
So I might actually, no, that's fine. So I think, so by way of agenda today, really looking at, firstly, we've got a carryover item from the previous steering group, which is what Carrie and Marie will be talking to up front, which is really around our community investments and some of the associated policy and policy work. And maybe just picking up on the, the introduction and conversation, I guess that the pertinent or relevant piece that's really relevant from an LTP perspective is this is both a way that we invest money, spend money, and the processes that sit behind it. And it does also have some implications over into the way we collect money, which is the either concessionary or commercial business perspective. So just kind of framing that piece up. And then as we kick into the revenue levers components of the session, and I think your point's really valid and well made, is I think the way I would frame that up as we go into those conversations is really this, the purpose of structuring this steering group around revenue levers is to provide that opportunity to have those conversations around what are those big three sources of income or revenue into the organisation, being either fees and charges, or rates, or development contributions. And obviously underlying that, we have the various policies such as the revenue financing policy, development contributions policy, and others. But really it's about what are those potential or actual sources of revenue, and what are the big rocks and big discussion points. So I think I'll just really just leave it there. And I'll bet Carrie and already. No, well, it's really just a reminder that we are at steering group 3. Which is today's focus, all about those revenue levers. And then from May and June, we'll actually be kicking through those activity plans, which is going to be very much around what is it that we're doing, what are our service, what are the kind of big chunks of either opportunity or challenges that we face at each of those service levels. So you say that we're in the nitty-gritty.
Okay.
Thanks, Ian. Kia ora koutou. I think Ian's actually stolen a couple of my points, but I just wanted to confirm that Carrie and I will be here today to discuss the ecosystem support that QLDC provides to community groups and organisations. I'll touch on community grants and funding and the process around managing requests for community facilities, which Carrie will talk a bit more to, and those broader policy settings and guidelines that support this ecosystem. We've been making improvements to this work over a number of years, and this is really us outlining our next steps, I suppose, in this work to try and mature the program that we do have. So we'll keep this discussion at a really high level. It is to help support Council's consideration of future ongoing and direct investment into community organisations and initiatives. There's a short series of slides. We've got the shortest series, hopefully, so it shouldn't take too long to run through those, but we'll ask you to wait until we finish to give us any questions. As I'm just wanting to note, as the Mayor mentioned, we're running into the annual plan funding rounds soon, and I recognise that there's a number of new councillors here who won't be aware of those processes, so some of those questions may come up about that process too, and I can take those offline at another point if we don't have time to answer those today. We're here to discuss this investment program and the value that it adds to our communities. As we're all keenly aware, the finances are stretched, both for council and for those living in our communities. We're seeing this for our community groups around funding cuts from both government and other funders, surging demand for services, workforce and volunteer shortages, competition for resources and demand for space. This is putting immense pressure on a number of our communities, and we can see that through the high levels of funding requests coming through both council in recent years, but also through our partner funders and other funders. QLDC is one of the few funders that provides operational funding that allows organisations, if you like, to keep the lights on. It's paying for core services and key staff. Rent is often a significant part of this contribution, particularly through our community fund. That's often a key part of what we deliver. Many of these groups that council supports have become key funders in delivering strategic outcomes and they make a valuable contribution that it will be vital to maintain a momentum in a number of areas. We have these strong connected community organisations also builds community resilience and pride in place, and is vital for social cohesion, particularly in communities like ours experiencing significant growth. So just lean into the slides a little bit now. So here is just an example of some of our key organisations that we fund. We cover across the full spectrum of sectors. The funding does not, what we do is we avoid supporting things that should be seen as core government, central government services. But we have a range of funding rounds now that have really grown in maturity over the last few years. And they provide benefit and deliver outcomes for community that are visible every day within our community. They provide an anchor point for council into community through a lot of the work that is delivered. So this is an example of one of our new BI dashboards. So we've been able to set up a new system called Smarty Grants in the last couple of years. So this is an example of us maturing the process. We're using a funding tool now that gives us a significant amount of data. So we're really at the point of being able to start to analyse that data across the board. We've been able to do that very easily before now. But this is an example of this year's current funding allocation. So you can see there we've had a demand for almost 7 million. We're able to meet about half of that through the current funding structures. And again, what we probably want to do more work on is that impact that is having in the community. What are those measures that we're seeing around the social return on investment we might have through this funding program? And that's an area of work we want to do more on in the coming period. Thanks, Kerry. So I'm putting on my glasses for this next slide. This is really just a summary of what we've been working on. So as I said, I mentioned the systems change and the policy work that we're doing with Kerry and the wider property team and other partners within council working on this as part of that maturity, really looking at whether the systems and processes we have now are working. We know over the last 10 years that increasing pressure means that some of those things do need to shift and evolve. We'll be looking at how we manage, and Kerry will speak to this a bit more, the community facilities process. As mentioned on the first slide, we have a number of over almost 70 current leases and licenses for community groups, but we've got at least as many requesting space from us at the moment, and we're trying to streamline that process and we're really looking on a way to do that. One of the things we want to look at in the coming months is what we're calling strategic partnerships. So these are some of those more significant partnerships we have with groups that are delivering quite major outcomes with all parts of council, and how we perhaps have a more sophisticated arrangement with those groups. And then we'll continue the ongoing sector collaboration and impact measures. So it's just me wanting to briefly touch on the program that we run and the impact that it has. I'm just going to hand to Kerry now to start to talk about the policy settings.
Yeah, so this just takes it up a little bit of a step. So Marie's spoken to the community funding aspect of this policy ecosystem. This is looking at the wider picture. Just a reminder that I'm sitting here today because this policy has been directed to be reviewed in line with the OTP. So the aim is a new policy adopted by council for June next year. That's an opportunity because we can take into account things that happen through the wider finance policies, and it also is a chance to consolidate policies that currently might exist in different spaces. We can rationalize them and have them speak to each other. So I think I can take most of these slides as read. This is showing what we want to achieve here. So this is our outcomes of this piece of work. The ecosystem on the right-hand side is intended to illustrate this. It is a complex area. There's lots of different activity groups that this touches on. It's not a particularly easy piece of work, but that I'm really confident this is a great opportunity to rationalize a lot of different spaces. Not intended to be a doomsday scenario here. This is really just showing current state of play. I would emphasize that we've made some really significant improvements, and Marie's spoken to that a bit through the Smarty Grants implementation. This is just showing where we're at, and that we've got some great objectives that we're seeking. At a really high level, what we would like to have is a tight brief policy that informs and has the criteria for any number of guidelines sitting underneath it. What that looks like in practice for the council is it would review this policy every 3 years, but the guidelines sitting underneath it can be more nimble, operational, and reactive to things that are happening in the minute. whereas what's up high is quite outcomes based and high level, and would look to include the current 2019 community facilities funding policy, the 2014 property acquisition and disposal community funding policy that is in draft form right now, but I'm reluctant and we don't have a name for it yet. It might be a monster acronym, because through this exercise, we will be identifying any gaps and adding them in there. So I don't want to just say we're combining 3 policies, because it's broader than that. What else do I have? The last slide here for us before turning it over to councillor discussion is touching on the process work that's happening in train with this policy. So this might be something you're aware of, that we're looking to, how does the council deal with requests from the community for facilities and land? And so we're looking at something where the policy is being developed at the same time as a process. We expect that there would be an interim process in place before the policy is adopted by council, and that's okay, because we can work through how that's going to look and have things rolling quite nicely by June next year. Seeing whether I have any other main points on that before turning to feedback. Hopefully that's given the council enough about what we're seeking to do, but today's workshop isn't to say, here's what we're proposing. This is to say, this is the outcomes we're seeking. I anticipate that there will be a committee fixture that we go to and say, these are the main moving parts, here's the options, and then it will be coming back to an LTP workshop later in the year.
Thank you. I'll kick off with guess on the community grants, and this is an observation, it's not a criticism, but when we start talking about we need a maturity in our system, and we're getting consultants to advise on impact measurement, which every community group in the area is already trying to do and struggling with and doing their own thing. And we have a smarty grant system, we have an person to operate that. I guess what the question would be, what is the cost? Organisation, staff time, software, licenses, consultants, giving away the money, and have we got the balance right? And I know we need to be accountable, but it seems to me that we put a lot of effort into managing giving away quite small amounts of money, and that's fair and that's reasonable, because it's ratepayers' money, and it's just I wouldn't know what level of comfort check I would have around that. It would be quite handy if somebody could say. So how that looks. Does that count? well, welcome to the meeting.
My colleague.
Very.
And they'll make a comment.
Look, I mean, I haven't got all the figures in front of me, but we definitely haven't yet invested in any consultants to work on the impact investment stuff. That's something Giovanni has been working on. He has made a relationship with Impact Lab, but that has been a collaborative piece that they'll be willing to work with us on at the moment. So, we've just been working on that internally and working with the Smarty Grants advisors. So they've got a really good network, and here in New Zealand and Australia where the company is based. So we'll work with them. There is a purchase. It's around the $25,000 mark where we initially set the system up, but I have to go back and check what our ongoing license fee is for that annually. But I can come back to you with that figure. And obviously there's the staff time that we invest in that. But other than that, it is a funding program that's almost well over $1.5 million. So percentage wise, it sort of depends on what sort of level you expect for that sort of investment, I suppose. And I just would say the investment envelope hasn't really grown that much in the last few years either.
But the costs surrounding it seem to have done, and as somebody that's been on the receiving end of many of those grants, I totally acknowledge the value and the way that they're magnified through the community. So it's not a question of that. Quentin, you were wanting to.
Yeah. I mean, I was just wondering, there's a couple of things. I mean, there's a couple of things I want to acknowledge. I think the strategic partnerships approach is really useful, something I've talked about a little bit over the last year or two. I think it's really useful to acknowledge that there's organisations that do more than, that help us deliver our objectives. And And so we can empower and leave it them to, achieve things that we as a council and our communities want to achieve. So I think those things are, a really valuable step. I think it has matured. It used to be a bit of a lolly scramble. We used to get this, and everyone used to get a little bit of money, and sometimes we split little bits of money to make it fairer on more, and it did feel a little bit. You wondered how effective that was. So, I mean, going back to the point, the whole program is $1.5 million or whatever, but the discretionary components of it and the bits that we're not locked in through other reasons are much, much smaller than that. And I think this year only $180,000 or something. So, I suppose I support the principle that we're more strategic. I'm not entirely convinced we need a complicated measurement tool to determine if we can measure it intuitively against our objectives, and I think we can sense check that without need for expensive tools is my feeling. But to also be more mature and complicated, more mature and sophisticated around our partnerships and what we're trying to achieve. So that's all I've got.
Yeah, sure. I was going to chip in as well. At this point, I probably made, maybe not this council, maybe the previous council, around the community funding grants, is the team does an awful lot with quite limited resources. And having worked with Marie for many years and for the team that works in this space, the growth has not, the cost growth is not significant in this space at all. They do an awful lot, and they've really matured the system from within and with internal expertise. So I think what we're seeing here is there's a much higher level of transparency of the kind of things that we're investing in. Whereas historically, the challenge has been that there were legacy arrangements that had been squirreled away in a part of the organisation that hadn't bubbled the way to the top. So this piece of work the team's done is really trying to surface all of those together so we can take full account of our relationships and do exactly as Quentin said in terms of leveraging those partnerships for organisations that can have greater impact. What's our collective impact together? And these grants are a really key way of doing that, and particularly through the trusted pathways.
And the other thing we're going to have to slowly do is just sort of try to achieve a more consistent level of service across the district as well, acknowledging that Queenstown and Wanaka do things quite differently, but we do have to try to create some equity or consistency there as well.
So coming back to your point, Chair, yes, we can work with finance to provide some accuracy around the points that you've asked of us.
And sorry, just one more. Chair's prerogative. You had it. And is this under the scope of what we're talking about right now? Is that things like the events grants and the whole parcel of things? So do we have a view, or should we have a view on, do we want to carry on supporting major events, or what's contestable, what's not? Because I guess there'll be some funds that the staff hold that are maybe not contestable, and I wouldn't know what those are or how big they are.
Well, I think that's part of work, particularly around the strategic partnerships piece. So a number of definitely key relationship managers within the organisation would manage relationships, and often through service agreements with different groups. And that's part of what we'd like to look at around strategic partnerships, is really ensuring that we've got a clear view of how the relationships are managed and supported alongside any grants. So grants tend to often be the operational baseline, but there might be project related deliverables.
What comes to Wild and Vines is a good example, because it's a very hungry beast, but it's one that has a very well documented return on both, economically from the but also on in return for the dollars that it levers as well through MB or MPI, whoever funded, I can't remember what it is. So they're those strategic partnerships going, well, we're locked. We've got to be careful that they're hungry, but they have a big return, but they also have an opportunity cost on other things.
So, I think Matt had a share and Reds. Sorry.
Can I just respond to the event point though? These policies don't relate to events. So event event funding is governed by a different policy.
Events policy, but
I think the process you're talking about is different for events.
Well, there will be some touch points
Yeah.
though around the broader principles.
But they're not exactly the same.
So I guess just phrase the question, and I'm not sure it might not be in this workshop. But at what point do staff want some direction on councillor thoughts on what size pot should be, what things we do fund, what things we don't fund? Is that part of LTP or do we see that?
The activity plans would be a place for you to have input into that. So there will be an activity plan for events, for example, which sets out what we are aiming to achieve out of events, what resources we put into supporting that, and the grants that are given. And I assume some in other areas. Well, that's a bit different because some of these other funds are spread over multiple.
Well, this is the challenge.
Yeah,
so
this
it
is the
depends
challenge.
yeah, I think that's probably a
Yeah.
discussion for us
But
to have.
there's a policy piece there because obviously the events funding policy is what drives the priorities in terms of, so,
Yeah.
you know, we've got to be, if we want to get ahead of that and say this pot of money wants to be reallocated differently or even shrunk, we need to think about that. But, you know, when it's very fair to say that when the events funding policy started, it was an economic development tool. It was about attracting people to the district. Now, we've come a long way from just attracting people to the district. And, you know, we started moving to attracting people to off-peak times. We started achieving other outcomes, community development outcomes and environmental outcomes and waste minimisation through the events funding strategy. So events funding policy. So we've got to be careful, as to which of the levers we're pulling.
So the activity plan for events is when we can talk about that, which will be one of the next two workshops. But on the broader community funding side, is there a future LTP session about community funding?
No, not at the present. I think that's probably something we need to talk to the program team about, so that
That's
we're
something
sure
we'll talk about.
if it needs to be presented in that way. I think that's part of the reason we wanted to be here now in this one of these earlier LTP sessions, so we can daylight this and get a bit of direction on how our councillors want to have a discussion around those different funds, because they are, while my team has oversight from an administration point of view and we directly run the community fund and a couple of the smaller funds, teams like the waste minimisation team run their own fund. We just provide them with that administration support to run it. So there are, you know, we wouldn't want to comment on their fund, if you like.
Actually, that is an example, sorry, the waste minimisation fund, when you are talking about waste as an activity, that will include talking about the waste minimisation fund. I assume it will, because that is what a big part of contributing to the achievement of the waste minimisation plan that was signed off last year is delivered by community groups that we fund to deliver that. So when you are looking at both the waste activity plan, but also from an infrastructure strategy, LTP investment perspective, you'll see that investment program for waste, which includes that. So some of these other areas will be covered in different places like that. So what we just need to talk about is if there is a way you can show it all together to show the cumulative picture of what's under management. Like
Just coming back to your question, Chair, we can clearly go away and then report back through Michelle about what you are asking of us. And it's been articulated, there's many streams of investment. Marie's covered off the pure community piece, that she would like to understand what the cost of doing business is. But within the organisation, there could be service agreements, there could be projects, there could be other projects, there could be economic settings, as picked up by the Deputy Mayor. There's a whole raft, and we just need to look at how we can then report that back. At this stage, we haven't got any time in coming back, but what we're picking up is you'd like to have a more broader, deeper conversation about Investment Inc.
And I'd like to explore about how we can do more of it in the shrinking world, because I think it's really, I think it's one of the most impactful things to do.
So, as it's been discussed, there's three elements to leave this group with. Firstly, that strategic partnership approach. You know, we work with the likes of the Wilding Group. They've been in this space for over 20 years, but yet we still make them jump through every 3 years a trusted partner and outcome that then also is contestable. The second point is and we haven't touched on it here, but we've been a lot to partner with other trusts and other opportunities, including the philanthropist approach. And we know there needs to be some greater detail around agility, around how we respond to some of those third-party investment opportunities. We do have a good track record. but it's often through a fixed channel about making sure we've come through, particularly with equity. I think is my third point around how we make sure that just because you may not be a big group or have deep pockets, that there's still an important part that we as an organisation have in ensuring that some of these groups still have an opportunity to be a part of how you take forward their own aspirations or grant applications and all the rest of it. Lots of good example welcoming communities as we see ethnic groups come together and connecting. We spend quite a bit of time on education and all the rest of it, making sure you're a part of that fabric of bringing it into a community. So I think we are more than happy to come back and have a detailed conversation. But we want to circle the wagons and make sure we understand what's expected and talk to Michelle about that.
Thank you. No, it wasn't really a question, it's more discussion around it. I'm fairly over what you guys do. I fully support the policy review and that overarching policy because at the moment it's, there's lots of policies and we went through it when we had our induction as the new committee and how many policies sit within that department is monstrous. So having an overarching sort of policy that actually brings them all together and makes sense of it all is quite important. This department is probably the lowest funded and makes every single dollar go the furthest out of probably any department, I would say. But also the volunteer hours in the community is, what's that?
Must be the chair.
Must be. What a good one. But the volunteer hours, we really can't measure that, and that's one of the big challenges. But I guess if this department wants to get really serious and picking up on Q's point around we don't need to measure these sophisticated measuring tools, the reality is if you want funding and you want it secured and you want support from elected members to give you that funding, you've got to have measures. You've got to prove your worth. You've got to justify every dollar that's given to the department. So just like every other department has to justify where its money goes and how it's spent, it's the same for this department as well. And that's why I think the work that you're doing now to really build a new framework that actually we can take forward for the future is great. I think the other key point about this department as well is the collaboration piece. Out of, again, all the departments, this is the one that collaborates the most with the community and gets as much sweat, blood and tears out of its community, out of any department. So we don't really understand the true value of every dollar that we give to your department. And if we had a better measuring stick of how much we get back from the community as a result for every dollar that we put in, I think we'd be pretty amazed by what we can get from that community. Picking up on your point around philanthropy, that's something that we are collaboratively working together on to try and look at other revenue streams. So while funding mechanisms and funding levers is coming up later, there's a discussion point that actually, we have our three key revenue streams, which is, rates, DCs and fees and charges. There's another one, which other councils are engaged with right now. We're still quite young, I guess, in developing that, but I think that's something that we can look at in the future in terms of philanthropy money to be able to leverage off some of that for our social infrastructure. And fortunately, it's only this department that will probably be attractive to philanthropists to fund social infrastructure more than pipes and roads. So I'll leave it at that. Cool.
My 2 cents. I have, obviously been fronting the community around big rates increases, and it's quite hard to deal with the dichotomy of going, there's a, massive increase in your rates and, we're looking at every dollar, and then there's a lottery on the other side that you can go and apply for this funding and, hopefully you can make money towards the initiative. It's a really hard conversation to have both at the same time right now. And I guess part of my intuition says that I'd rather steer, to Quentin's point, more towards at a high level, how do we best deliver a service? And if we're not the people to best deliver it, what is a community group that's going to best deliver it for us and stay with those strategic objectives versus we've got a grant, it's $50,000 a year and whoever can apply for it is going to be able to do that because that feels more like, lottery. And that's what's hard. I know Smarty grants is a sophistication. It also makes it really hard for anyone to apply because it's incredibly onerous on the applicants on all of those things. And Michelle's made a point before about bureaucracy is careful spending of public money. I think it's important that we're prudent in every dollar, and I take the sentiment that we make it stretch as far and wide as possible. I think just to add into the conversation is this is what's creating a lot of that bulk that is attributing to really high cost pressures, and especially for these rural communities that are facing their own infrastructure on top. That conversation piece is really hard to have at the moment, and I think that's something we need to be mindful of for the conversation moving forward, given that we're trying to show our level of due diligence and prudence without speaking. So
yeah. Thanks for the succinct approach you took on Mayor's request. So well done. I wonder, particularly when the conversation moved into events funding too, and the earlier point you made, Murray, about, and it is a point I've made in previous workshops in particular, looking at the LTP, current LTP, there's a page there on strategic investment priorities. None of what we're talking about here is covered in that section. So, and there's a range of policies, a lot of policies. There doesn't appear to be anything that actually draws them all together in the way that Matt was talking about perhaps being a need to. And I think it gets back to one of your earlier questions or observations. I think there's clearly a need for that so that our communities know what we're delivering for them, and more importantly, that everyone can understand the context within which that's all happening, take into account some of what Cody said there too, that these are not easy times. So what are the important things? What are the things that we get best value from? And some of those currently would be intangible because there aren't dollars attached to them, but they're those partnerships you're talking about. So, and maybe as I started writing a few notes here, I could see where you were suggesting the title of what something like that might be could be quite large, but it's something like community, environment and economic partnerships and investment strategy, because the partnerships are probably more important than the little bit of money that we actually provide. In the grand scheme of things, not very much money, but we can make a difference. And more importantly, it's what our communities are doing that's making the real difference, and we're just helping them along. So how can we do that better? I think we need to have a strategic conversation in this LTP round, different from the past, that asks some of those questions. Where can we go together to get more value in a broad sense, not just a monetary value of this place that we call home and into the future? And I think we could achieve a lot more than the really good stuff that's going on. And there might be some hard decisions. There might be some things that we've been doing for a long time that are only piecemeal and not actually achieving much. And the ask that we're putting on some community groups to just report on what they're doing, even without much qualitative assessment, they'd probably be better off just raising the money themselves. How can we do that to ensure that may be the case? I'm not saying it would be. How can we do those things better? We can only do that if we have those sort of bigger picture conversations about how we can do this better together. So the framework's there's some really good tools, but it's not coherent. I think you made that observation. I think most around the council table would like to see more coherence in that space to achieve more. So, you.
Agree with John's point on broader value and what we can do to assist partnerships without staff too big in that space, balance. Agree with Cody and Quentin on the strategic direction in terms of where we fund. But just a couple of other points that go into this policy thing. I think I'm just trying to understand the wisdom of combining these three things into one, especially given the different departments that cross over across those three policies, thinking property and community community partnerships. Given that these things are going to have to go to a committee, it needs to make sense. To me, there's sort of a split between what the property team should be dealing with in smart finance and what the community, environment committee should be dealing with your department. So I just kind of questioning the wisdom of lumping it all together, creating one big long policy that crosses multiple departments and committees.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that currently property is working really closely already with community services on all these things, that even though it's a separate policy, if you look at this 2019, it does involve both of those activity groups. There's no way around that.
Yeah.
So I'm fairly comfortable with a policy that is going to have to clearly signpost who's doing what, but that if it's all in one place, then it's quite clear. Whereas the counter argument is if you ring fence an individual policy for an activity group, it's not possibly going to be able to ensure that we're dealing with things in a cross-council connected that way.
And also ring fencing it for one committee. So I'd actually point to the lynch block conversation, which on one hand is a property discussion that could be purely financial, but actually what we're talking about is whether the financial outcome or the community outcome is the one that we want to focus on. And so if you're taking it to one or the other, you can't have that cross-functional discussion. So that's why we're at full council. And this policy, that would be that's a good example of where this policy would apply, because it would, and that's part of the point of this, is to encourage us to look at all the potential uses, all the potential places that the funding could be invested, not just using it from the beginning.
Yeah,
which is what these current policies do.
No, that makes sense. Thanks. That was really good. The other thing I was just going to say is if we're developing guidelines that presumably won't be signed off by the council, so they'll have a policy and then we'll have the guidelines underneath it. Just need to have some engagement with us really early on what would sit where, because I think it will define how prescriptive the policy needs to be. The more we pass off to guidelines, the more prescriptive.
We actually anticipated that question today, and would view that it's going to depend on the content of what the particular guide. There are some things that clearly we are going to come back to council as a decision maker, and there are other things that hopefully we can set up delegations, but that is a staff, and that will depend on what moves.
Sounds good. And I guess we need along the way some options on those things around where the control sits, so that we have a range of options to choose from, pros and cons, all that stuff. And the other things just. This covers a broad range of interests in the community. I think we need to go out really early for pre-engagement to understand what different sectors of the community think. We need to make sure we highlight it. I don't know what you call the engagement, to make sure that it speaks to the people leasing the wharves, as well as community groups, as well as potential people want to just I don't know. So how you do that is. I'd like to see that. Obviously, we'll be signing off on the consultation. I'm assuming there will be some.
So as policy, so roughly the timelines in officers' view is just that we need a draft policy by the end of the year. For council to then approve in the new year and for it to be bundled up with the LTP. So any early engagement will need to happen on this side of that.
Yes.
And so when and I think that's probably the next step is that we come to a committee to discuss this. We may have a discussion about what type of engagement may or may not be indicated depending on the degree and scale.
I would say, given that it is going to be crossing committees and some things would necessarily sit with full council because they're across the board, I'd say this one sits with full council because there's more to it than just community and environment. As you say, it's property and acquisitions. It's quite broad. So I'd quite like to see it come to full council because it does come with
we can consider that. Just conscious of fixtures getting really booked.
Look, we can, if it's highlighted, we can all jump in as long as Matt doesn't mind us sitting in. That's fine.
Oh, actually, that was going to be my suggestion. That sometimes I just have to I come to full council. But to Nikki's point about maybe are they better separate? I think that since I've been a councillor anyway, I think there's so many different areas that there are long-term niche agreements that actually it does need to come under policy, and this is a piece of work that could do that. So I really support it.
Just a question. You said you said that it's unique with respect to us. We're fairly unique that we actually provide OPEX, operation expenditure, and again, don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to anything you do. I think the multiple that we get having been a recipient of community and sporting grants, multiple that we get back from your grants is very, very high. But can you just give me an idea? Is there a policy around OPEX, or is it just on a case by case basis? And just an example or two.
Do you mean a policy about what?
Is there a
funding might
policy
be?
around OPEX? So for instance, if I want a building,
Mhm.
you might grant for the thing, but for the OPEX, maintenance, is it continuing maintenance? How does it work?
I think what you're asking is a different question from grants. So if you're talking about a piece of community infrastructure, that requires a different conversation. If we're just talking purely about grants, where I might be a community group renting a commercial property, and part of my request to council is a grant to cover the rent for that property.
Okay, so that's the OPEX.
That is what I was talking about by OPEX. That is but what you're asking, I think, is a separate conversation around supporting and development of social.
You're saying that's unique among councils.
Well, it's unique among funders. So not a lot of other funders. So some of our main regional funders don't provide operational funding.
CLT or OCT or something like that.
Not in the same way. So ours is a lot more flexible, let's just say.
Would that be the same for coordinator?
Yeah, that's right. If you want a coordinator for your group, that often a lot of the funding will be council funding for those sorts of things.
Since I was that person, so thank you.
Not for salary.
That's exactly what it is. Whereas a lot of funders don't supply that.
Central government funders do. So a lot of them do that.
Just a really quick one off the back of my last point, just the sale and acquisition policy being lumped in. I can see some advantages, but I can also see being lumped in with community and facilities and that broader conversation about value. It has some advantages, but there may be times when it's just about infrastructure value, and why would you not have sale and acquisition alongside infrastructure? Why would you not? I just think we need to be really careful that it doesn't. I don't know how to articulate it well, but that it doesn't become all about funding facilities and funding.
So I guess the question would be, if we had something we were selling, how do we decide whether it just pays off debt, whether it actually goes to support some other community groups like the Sker Height Fund, or so I guess it's that sort of higher up the tree sort of decision. I'm not sure where that's it.
Sitting in a facility that's begun with a big values discussion around facilities and
So through you, Chair, and carry on the review, but what we can do is just come back and actually step through what we currently have in play, which is 12 years old, 13 years old, and Roger and Aaron and the team actually deliver a lot of that space as we go. And then what it could potentially look like, because what I'm hearing is we'd like to make sure you don't then find that we've created something that's bespoke. It doesn't give you the opportunities. That might be an asset that purely you just want to dispose of, make it on the income and put it back on the debt.
Yeah, and if the policy doesn't align with that, it becomes difficult.
So we just need to make sure that that's the way we report back on how we report on the outcomes of what Terry's just shared.
So that will be the process that's reported back as this policy is developed. And just thinking about John's comment at the beginning in terms of the LGP process and wanting to pull out of the detail of this kind of stuff. But that process for developing this policy will go to either the committee or to full council. And it will include how we cover all of those outcomes. Just in the interest of but I think that can cover all of that in that process.
I think Nikki's point is well made.
Yeah.
And we can take that way and think about it. And basically, that either speaks to the policy has to be crafted in a certain way to enable that decision to be made, or there's parts of the policy that maybe have to be separate policy. But I think the team.
My point wasn't well made. You're making it.
That's why I think Jonathan like that. You better think of it as a strategy within which there are a whole lot of policies, some of which will need to balance against one another. And it should include decision-making tools to determine, well, this is just a property decision, or this is a community and partnership decision. So the strategy should provide that framework for us to navigate within, to use and draw together the policies that are going to deliver the best outcomes.
So we can take that way to consider. A point I just wanted to also daylight is to not forget that the council also does commercial leases and licenses.
Completely separately, yeah.
Larger than around community, and that's valid that we need to have that discussion. But that commercial aspect also needs to be accounted for. And
Yeah.
And one of the options I think needs to be considered is whether we continue charging based on a percentage of turnover or a percentage of profit, given the different way different businesses are structured. I think when we go out for consultation, that needs to be an option with some pros and cons and discussion.
So, Chair, playing back at a granular level, you would like us to report back on the cost of actually doing business. Just summarising, making sure we've got a clear, covered product. The table is keen for us to also make sure we're touching on the other elements, not just what Marie's, but also what you're thinking Penny and other elements and what the organisation's investing in. Covered off strategy, policy, and what the elements you'd like us to pick up on. Piece around philanthropy and the ability and the agility. And you'd also like picking up on Councillor Tucker's point, at an operational level to ensure that we're also thinking about that affordability, given that we're also experiencing at a staff level and that interface with the pressures we're seeing around how we factor that as part of this broader conversation, which might be a difficult conversation at a point. And then finally, that strategic partnership piece you've all echoed back is an important component we need to continue to reflect on how we do business. Is there anything we've missed?
I think we've covered off on John's point about strategy, not policy, but I think that's worth having a separate discussion about because it's not.
Carrie's picked up on that.
Yeah,
It's just-
it is a slightly
It's just left it to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think John might be talking about something slightly different, which fits more into the LTP discussion.
An
So,
umbrella piece here. And then we might do all this outside of LTP, but ensure we're not affording time to it.
Yes. Sure, but both.
Right.
Could you repeat that stuff back in the end of session stuff? So thank you.
Thank you. That's like somebody will transcribe the recording.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, it's a good discussion, right? We lead off in an environment which we know firsthand. We're all dealing with an affordability issue, and we're trying to make sure that we're really upfront about what's ahead of us.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Teamwork.
Appreciate it.
Right. Revenue levers. Here we go.
Yeah,
Are we ready for this?
get creative.
Yeah.
Right, got the green team coming in.
Excellent.
Yeah. This is Patty's, two of us direct reports. Yes. Introductions.
I'm just going to ask, whilst you're sitting at the table, for councillors, just think of, in terms of the information that we've had provided for us and all is there any specific things that you don't understand that you'd really like just some explanation of before we consider how we use all these things? Anyway, that's just to hold that thought and let the team introduce themselves. Welcome.
Hello, so I'll just do some introductions here. So on my right, we've got Vanessa Bouth. So she's our new financial controller. So sort of picking up a lot of our policies, including the revenue financing policy. And over here is Victoria Harper. So Victoria is our financial services manager. So in essence, that's looking after our rates team. So particularly relevant here and our
Do you want to just quick start with that? Does anyone have anything that they don't understand around the rates and the pieces that, because we've had workshops on those and induction and more information? Yeah. Cool. So what would you like to get from us today?
Okay. So, first of all, I just want to say LTP is my favourite time of the year. If you get a chance to talk to your community about how you want to fund your services, you get started from scratch again. LTPs have been around for a long time, so all these decisions around who pays for what has all been made a long time ago, and every 3 years it's refreshed. And every annual plan you refresh it again. So, but this gives you a chance to really start from scratch, really think about how you want your services to be funded. And that's why we wanted to have this session today, I want to prepare you for when you go to your activity plans next session and the session after. I'm thinking about how do I want this service to be paid for? So having those tools, those levers, those in your back pocket so that you're going, actually, do I want to be rating for this? If I don't, well then maybe I shouldn't be doing the service. So just keeping that in your back
I'll
of
just
your
make a
mind.
point too. I mean, I just note the previous two LTPs, we haven't really had this luxury because one was a COVID LTP and the other was a post leaky homes LTP. So yeah, I mean, I just want to, you know, this is really important and it is encouraging that we're, you know, got a fresh start, so to speak, but we haven't had that luxury in recent times. So
Just to add, sorry, Catherine, I think that's your empowering tone is also a big difference in terms of changing the conversation, so it's much appreciated.
Cool. And yeah, just the Rating Act, we've sent you a slide, which I love. It's great. Nice and easy to understand. Okay. And yeah, it was just a reminder about what the legislation that we have. So the Rating Act is very old. It's very prescriptive. And then we've got all these other policies which are prescribed in the Local Government Act we need to do, and they're all connected. They're all, we change something here, it changes and it flows through to somewhere else. So we just wanted to kind of highlight what those were. And obviously you're aware of all the reform and the legislation changes. So we've got to be adaptable, we've got to be able to change and flex throughout this next year. There was just a note there about further sessions on revenue as such, that you will have multiple goes at doing, looking at this. And I just included what our current revenue sources are. A big one that we missed was NZTA. So NZTA provide us with a sizable amount of money. And one of the challenges that we have is when they decide who gets what money, is normally after we decide what we want to include in our plan. So it's quite often misaligned. But we try to have those conversations with them. It's just up to their governments as to when and how much we'll get.
and one of the weird things we have to stand off with them is that they won't tell us what they're likely to subsidise or provide input into until we've got it in our LTP, but we can't create our LTP until we've got some. So there's this weird standoff that we have with them every time, but they make it very clear that it has to be at least in our program, whether it be early or late, in order for them to even consider it in the RLTP and LTP process.
But I guess we'd have more scope with increased headroom to put some of those projects in.
But that doesn't guarantee that they'll fund it either.
No, but it means that if they don't fund it, we don't need to. Yeah. So.
And the other thing to be noted is that they don't fund necessarily all our projects. There is a financial assistance rate, which is roughly about 51%. But there are some unsubsidised projects that we have. So, those are ones that you maybe want to consider. Do I really want to 100% kind of recover those from ratepayers? The other thing I just wanted to draw attention to is that when we talk about average rates, it's actually taking all of the rates, general, targeted, uniform and general, and then dividing it by the rating units. So that when you see the percentage rate increase, that's how it's calculated. It's no science behind it. It's just a total number divided by rating number, rating units. And that's what's used by the media. That's what's used by DIA. So taxpayers union. So
are we required to have a headline rate?
No, I mean I'd rather have dollars because that's what to me is meaningful, is how much dollars has increased. And what's to say that the baseline number is the right number? That's what percentages. So
I think it's probably doomed by percentages over the years.
But how you spin it, they'll always come out with a percentage.
What happens with new mass curriculum? Who knows what they measure?
The other thing I would say is that when we get audited, so we get audited on the consultation document, we get audited on the long-term plan actual final document, and they also audit the process. So all the decision making along the way, all the discussions that we're having. And so one of the things is they don't like promissory notes. So they don't like it where we have, we promise that we will get some revenue from somewhere. That's not really certain for them. So they will often tell us to take that revenue out if that's not a source. So for example, if the philanthropist, we go, we think we may get $10 million from a philanthropist funds, whatever. We can't put that in unless it's kind of really certain. So that's just a thing to keep in the back of your mind as well.
How likely would there be to challenge our growth projections? Because we've generally been conservative on those.
Well, we have a methodology and a way we use our spatial plan and for the government contributions policy. I guess there's a methodology where it's got to be in the LTP. The project has got to be classified as a growth project before it can get into development contributions policy.
In terms of our assumptions about numbers of people who'll be paying.
Yeah. They look at all that.
We are conservative, but we're not far off year to year, to be fair. I mean, and we adjust year to year. I mean, we're better off being slightly conservative than the other way around, because otherwise we're then short, not. But yeah. The other thing we can't. I was just going to say the other thing we don't bank on is obviously the QAC dividend, because it can't. I don't think the auditors allow us to make it as achieving revenue, do they? It's only an upside revenue. So
we'll come to the dividends. There's a slide on dividends, but in principle, whatever the SOI says, that's what we're looking at. And I've just pulled out the water only portion. So what you're looking at in that graph is an LTP revenue sources. If we were to do an LTP right now, that's where, so rates is 53% of our revenue. And then you look at the water circle, kind of small to see, but a lot of that is storage rate. That's what the blue side is. And then the next slide was just really looking at rates, so taking that 53% part of the pie and then breaking that out. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of different targeted rates. And just of interest, general rates is actually 0.7 million, so 5.5%. So very little is actually through a general rate. There's quite a large portion through a uniform annual general charge. We'll come through to explain what that is. So
just going back to those previous charts, I mean, it's still either whatever way you slice the pie, it still feels to me that development contributions are horrendously low, because you look at the.
But you mean look at the water.
Yeah, so I understand both those charts, but either way.
50% of water is growth.
Yeah, but every playground, every library, every playing field, is growth related, or at least a large proportion of it. And so, and even the, if you include water on the other graph, then such a huge amount of our program, roading, water, wastewater, it's just so much more than we actually account for is growth driven. It's the as I've said before, single biggest problem we have to fix is dealing with growth costs.
Just go back really, really quickly on your current revenue source. The second one, confused by the rates revenue for water has arrows down.
Yeah.
Is that just a typo?
We'll give you it's actually stormwater for Wanaka is the yellow beach.
Yeah. Easy confusion.
That's a little bit out of the chart, because you've got sports halls and libraries.
Yeah, and that's what to do for.
Yes. Okay. Right. Sorry.
Did the same thing though. Okay. So the revenue and financing policy, I think I've told you this many a times. I have this beside my bed. It's my Bible. And so as you're going through your activity plans, I would have this open. I'd be looking here to go, what does the current LTP say for governance, for example? What are the things, have we got this right? Have we got who's paying correct? And then we are doing a revenue and financing policy external review, and that actually closed today.
Yes, the
procurement.
proposals.
The proposal. So we'll be evaluating who's going to be helping us with that. So
Who talks to the mission for that?
sorry,
Whoever gets that work, what's their mission?
they've got a scope, which is to, I guess, from taking the revenue and financing policy through to our rating tables, through to our into our LTP documents.
And that's comparing what we do here now against elsewhere. And
It's facilitating your discussion around what you want to change.
So, yeah, it would be quite helpful to understand that in a bit more detail and make sure it covers everything that we do want to cover so that we don't get down the road and have something that's not as useful as it could.
Including,
Is there a way to-
yeah, to influence that.
yes.
It was on the list.
Okay. Oh, I mean, if it's gone out, the scope's out.
Yeah,
but I guess yeah. I mean, because if we're going to be going through a process that's with somebody external to refresh this, we don't want to probably spend too much time individually now stressing about them if we're going to be returning to them. But understanding the process, what's the public good? Should there be 20% of our consenting costs on the general rate, versus 100% user pays? Who knows? So I presume that's the sort of discussion that piece of work will lead to. I think it's a really hard question, but obviously you've looked around the place elsewhere before coming in here. What are the biggest opportunities that we've got in terms of looking at all of this from your perspective as somebody that has to run it all?
Like I said, it's really complicated. There's a lot of differentials. There's a lot of makes it really hard for people to understand how it's calculated. One of the things that other councils have worked at is the uniform annual general charge, because that's equally shared across everybody in the whole district. A lot of people try to keep that as low as possible, so it's quite high here, because that then means that everybody's paying the same amount. So it's thinking about is this item, are those activities, are they for the public good in equal manner? Should they equally be paying the share?
There's a cap on that, I see, of 30%, 26%.
Yeah, so all the fixed charges, there's a cap. Bearing in mind that a lot of fixed charges, correct me if I'm wrong, are in order. Yeah.
It's going to take
So
most of it.
they don't have the rate capping and they don't have the same issues that this revenue and financing policies will be.
Does the general rate form part of that 30%?
No, it's I think everybody. Fixed charges are where everybody pays the same. Yeah.
So is rubbish collection a fixed charge? Well, not everyone charges is pays rubbish collection.
Yeah,
So
It is a fixed charge.
it is.
So in the review then, does that include considering opportunities to use rates to encourage strategic behaviour changes that other policies talk to?
Yeah, we're more than welcome to consider. I mean, at the moment we have differential visitors. So so you can continue that, or you can change it. Yeah. Thank you.
Simplifying is a good start.
Yeah.
As we all are currently experiencing.
These guys have to answer all the phone calls from the email and try to explain it.
So
You said uniform general charge is high here. As opposed to what? What's a percentage? Just comparison.
So for example, when I was at Environment Canterbury, I think it was $25, and ours is 287.
and that's because there's far more on user pays. Is that correct? Or targeted? So targeted.
It's uniform, so everybody pays the same.
Yes, but it's lower in Canterbury because they would have
They
more on
believe that it was an
targeted.
equity thing, and so they really drove down putting it into other rating types.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
but what are the other rating types? I think is what they're asking. Are they targeted rates and
Probably more
same as general rates?
Then it puts back on capital value.
Right, so it's more weighted to capital value than general, okay, right. And that's the point that Cody's on. Yeah, so by shifting, reducing that amount, we would potentially put more onto higher value properties.
Right, Arrowtown.
I was going to say one. It's like town's not the only one.
Yeah, okay. But that, and again, the amount that would go on that general rate, if we wanted to increase that, that's not part of the 30% cap. Yeah, that limit that we're not. Okay, cool, thank you.
Council, I should know this, there's 56,000 people in the district. How many rate paying households?
So obviously,
We have
the
like
more,
18,000 rating units.
the more rating units we get, the less we have to spread the rates over. But it's rates it is because it's spread over people.
When you think we keep that thing next to you at night,
Yeah.
do you dream at night that you'd like to raise that uniform general charge?
We would be, we're near the cap for fixed charges, so we would probably not be able to.
So, I mean, notwithstanding, is that we have a lot of holiday houses and stuff, are we way below the average around residents per rating unit? Because that's pretty, I mean, that's only 1 point, like, something, 1.5.
We have a thing with LGNZ, and they were talking about cost of infrastructure per resident, and Queenstown was almost double in its size. Like we're very expensive of the amount of infrastructure per resident, and part of that might speak to your point around what we have to provide. I think affordability, if we look at our actual rates, we're not ridiculous when it comes to.
Not nominal value, yeah.
Yeah.
Have we got, and speaking to that, I've structured it twice or whatever, are we able to, quantify a figure of how much we're having to pay for infrastructure, water supply, wastewater, over and above what the resident population would be needing if we took a comparator somewhere, and then say, what is the gap between what we're actually having to do and what we've got? Where do we get that funding from?
We've done that exact analysis supporting the visitor levy. So we've got that work was done in 2018 originally. We had it updated as part of the regional deal work. So there we've got financial analysis that shows what proportion of our services investment and infrastructure investments, OPEX and CAPEX, is attributable to visitor requirements, not residential requirements. And if you include water, it's about I'm going to.
Yeah, but I mean, you pay for it
about
anyway.
35 million a year. Across CAPEX and OPEX is attributable to visitors, which is why we're affording.
An increase on 40?
And so, which is why we've, so originally the 5% visitor levy essentially came back with it only covered 30% of the visitor attributable costs, but with water gone, it almost fully covered it. So I think it's 5.7% would fully cover our costs attributable to visitors. Which is different to tourism infrastructure used by visitors. These are our core services that are used by visitors.
The problem is we have to reframe the visitor levy discussion in order to because of that. Like we can no, because the borders being pulled out, we can no longer rely on the visitor levy to offset the water infrastructure costs. So
the water infrastructure would be a different conversation because they're going to have to move the way that they do their pricing anyway, which will be on a use basis, which will take into account the visitor usage. So that will be built into the cost of visitors.
My point being, if we are to continue to pursue a visitor levy, then we need to reframe the visitor levy in such a way that it, offsets the needs we have, being visitor infrastructure and transport, probably, which is one of the businesses we have currently. Yeah.
So at the moment, it's been premised on council infrastructure, but if we were promised the visitor levy, we could determine that we wanted it to, we could agree with government that we wanted it to go into broader infrastructure. That would just mean we get less of it and more of it might go towards transport infrastructure that wasn't ours.
That misses my point. I think we need to reframe it in such a way that we can direct it where we need it, not give it away.
So
So
it's currently framed as we asking for it all to come to us.
I know, but it's no longer makes sense because the water is taken away. And anyway, my point is that moving forward, we need to reframe the discussion around the visitor levy so it makes sense in the new context. So,
I mean, where the money comes from, but I think being able to quantify that gap, you know, so we're having those conversations. If we're rate capped, you know, we'd be able to do that if we didn't have tourists. And then if we're struggling to cover that cost, that is the missing bit that we've somehow got to recover from the tourism ecosystem, one way or another, whether that's tourist parking in the lakefront down here or whatever. You know, there's all of those things that we need to look at. So that's a really good one to be able to think about as an outcome. Yeah, how do we start to work towards gathering that? The other one will be, as Quentin's, on the growth side of things. You know, what is our best estimate of the gap of what we're not capturing in the growth space? And I don't expect an answer at the table, so I haven't asked. But I think if we try to understand what are the problems we're trying to fix through all the tools we've got, I think it's a really good way. So we can talk to the ordinary person that's lived here for 20 years and doesn't work in tourism and say, well, your rates are reasonable because this is everything else we've done. So
we could make that more visible definitely through this process. These are the costs of visitors.
Yeah.
You are paying them at the moment. Unless we do something different. And you could, part of the conversation is with you through this process, what are different things we could do to cover that if we don't get a visitor levy?
Yeah.
That's exactly right, and that's what we need, because I still haven't heard any acknowledgement of, we just been talking about it for forever and people kind of been chipping on the side, but what is that gap and why do we have it? Where in the current policy are we falling over? Until we know that, we can't fix it. And until we can fix it, we start to adjust for the excessive costs by trimming and changing things elsewhere, but we're not addressing the cause of the problem.
Yeah.
And so how do we start from there? Because you're wanting us to come back and look at different activity plans going, what should we fund by how much? And we're doing that in the context of rates have gotten too high. If rates have gotten too high because we're not funding, collecting sufficient for the growth.
Well, I think it would be great if we could fix the 40 million, and then it's amazing what we could do for our community teams. That it would be, it would be really good, even if the rates stayed the same, but we'd actually have another 40 million to give out to community organisations.
Just regarding, I acknowledge that one of the bits of information we got back last night had a little pie chart type thing splitting out the percentages. Now that's a great start. And it might be that there's a growth percentage, there's a level of service percentage and a renewals percent, but there might be a visitor percent, there might be a visitor wedge at that as well on each activity class, because unless we can understand that stuff, that when we really the proportionality.
Can I just add to what Quentin's saying, because there's also a graph in there that talks about how much is collected from the visitor sector, how much is collected from the commercial sector, how much is collected from the residential sector. But it's done on the number of properties rather than the number of DEs. And so we're not comparing apples with apples. And so, when you look at a small number of visitor properties funding a relatively large portion of the rates, but how many DEs are contained on those properties? We need to be comparing the right things, and because it gives an artificial view of, visitors are paying for themselves more so than residents, but actually not if you did it on a DE basis. So we need the right information in front of us, and we need to understand some of these core issues before we start diving into the detail of, should we be funding rent for, how do we pay for this particular activity? The big chunky stuff we need to do now at the front end of the LGP, so that other stuff flows naturally from it.
It's a good segue to my point, which is great. I think the structure of things, you talk about strategies. What precedes strategies is, I think, with vision statements, whether it's growth pays for growth, or whether it's visitors enrich the area, not burden it, or whether it's people understand what they're paying for. They're just these sort of fundamental statements that we can go back and say, is it doing that? Then it's succeeding. So then the vision statements inform the strategy informs the policy. The policy creates the algorithm that then shows the outcomes. So I feel like we've often done strategies, but as governors not been clear around what those vision statements are that we're trying to achieve, which captures a lot of these sort of views of what we're trying to get across. A good example of where things fall over to help illustrate the point is roading, it's transport. Everybody pays road user charges. So per kilometre, you pay tax that then gets pulled to only pay for half the roads, only the highways. It doesn't go to us at all. That the government comes to us and say you should be building pipes and roads. It's like, no, we shouldn't actually build any roads because we don't have a user pays mechanism that funds it. And to sort of ignore it and go, oh yeah, it's a congestion issue. It's like there is a user pays mechanism right in front of us, but it's not proportionally funded because every tourist or visitor doesn't pay a cent to rates that half the roads they drive on. So fundamental things like that we can sort of be very clear at articulating around this table and then around other tables that we all meet with other governors and higher up, I think is going to be the most useful way to achieve the outcomes ultimately down at the end to drive that. And I think, shaping this discussion into those statements that really clarify what our objectives are so that can then filter down into strategies and policies is going to be the most useful way to move through this.
Right, we're sorted. Where should we go next?
Probably more so the actual revenue and finance review kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll just
Yes,
get
thank
into
you.
this one. So this will be, once the revenue and finance review starts, we'll go through the rates that we actually have and we'll break down everything and we'll look at, are we rating the right way? Should we be changing any of this? How do we change it? And then we'll actually look through all of the samples and go through everything and make sure it's working out the way that we're wanting it to work out. And this is what the consultant or contractor that we hired will do. And so it's quite in depth to do a revenue and finance review, but it should be quite good to actually go through it and actually go, are we doing this the way that we should? And what is the best way to do this going forward? What works for us and what are we happy with? So just to bring that to your attention, probably offer the revenue and finance policy. We could jump ahead to rates.
Yeah, and just on the timing of that review, so
Yes.
Gets is closing, or is it just gone up on Gets?
No, so Gets is closed.
Yep.
And so we're just going through the process of actually selecting which person, and then hopefully by May, we would have someone in place.
And obviously they listen to this recording and.
Yeah.
Yeah. So soon.
Yeah,
great.
very soon.
But I mean, remember your activities
Yeah.
drive the costs,
Mhm.
and only half of it at the moment is paid for by rates. So it's only part of our funding opportunity. And I do have one thing here that I'd love some guidance on right now, if that was possible. Was around the dividends. So at the moment, we currently have in our revenue and financing policy that that is to be paid off, used to be paid off on debt. I'm used to seeing CCOs dividends to be going to offset rates. So it's just really, I guess those are two options. It is, how does that feel? What's your approach?
I'm suggesting, we've always been told that it can't, so, look, I'm open to that. We can look at it differently, so.
We're going to have some headroom, so, we don't have to pay off debt.
Exactly.
I know how to, yeah. Yeah. So if there's an opportunity to look at that, you can.
I think that's the thing, we've got plenty of headroom outside, that's what changes the game.
Yeah, so is that what's changed, that we will have headroom? So until now we didn't, so we've only had the choice to pay off debt.
I think that was
Is
the
that-
policy said that
Was, yeah.
there was actually a policy. Yeah.
But when was the policy set?
So part of the LGP, the revenue and financing policy.
So was it a new, was it a new part of it though?
We're always told we couldn't bank on it because it wasn't a sure thing. It depended on the performance of the company as to, so you go, you hope you might be at $10 million, but you're not.
And so was that
definitely
why it
gonna
was,
get
was that
10%.
why
It's
it
always
was,
attributed.
was that why it was just a bonus?
Yeah, it was
paid
treated
out
as an
debt
upside.
rather than.
Treat an upside which pay back on debt. Now, the other I think is that it happens midstream. So you've already set the rates so you can only do it to offset rates for the following year, I think. So we've got to roll it forward, which is the other problem because you can't assume you've got it till you've got it, by which time you've already set the rates and the people have already got the bills. So you've got to roll it forward to the following year to offset. So you're using last year's dividend to pay for rates remission on the following year.
We don't use it all though either. We could use partial. And we could also, I'm just wondering how much more direction we could provide around a smaller amount via the SOI, because we could do that, I think.
Pretty much smaller amount.
To actually, at the moment, we're really flexible because we're like, well, you know, it's a company and it's going to juggle things how it wants. But, you know, the dividends are actually pretty large now, consistently large. So, and they're pretty good at forecasting. So yeah, could we say through the SI, you know, we need this much, we're banking on this much, and you know, if we could use that, but for the rates and the rest of paid, I don't.
Aurora problem then.
What's that?
We get into the Aurora problem then when they took too much out of the system. I mean, I think we take as much out of it as it can get. You know, not more than, and
certainty.
So we've got to be super careful there. I think in the context of us owning 3/4 of an airport, which is quite impactful, to be able to show some tangible benefit, financial. You know, people always say, "What's in it for me?" They don't see the debt level dropping down by 10 million has any impact on them, although it will. But you know, 10 million is what, 3% off the rates.
I mean, the other side of that is
The interest.
we'd obviously love to have that available to us this year, obviously. Okay, you know, let's use the rates to, and I don't know if there's any opportunity to do that, but by the time we actually do the LTP and it comes into effect in the first year and not possibly even doesn't actually roll over till the second year of the LTP in terms of we actually haven't projected our rates to determine whether we need it or not. So we've got to have some discretion to determine whether that's the right thing at the time based on the numbers.
Specifically to, I guess, your question, I'd like to see it offsetting rates now that we have got that headroom, because we don't necessarily know what our water rates are going to be, and no doubt they're going to increase. So to offset that, well, rates are rates, regardless of whether it's water or it's just council normal general rates. So I think now that we've got this opportunity, that would be the direction instead that I'd like to see.
You could think of it as visitors. Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Here you go.
But also, I guess it was originally intended that it would, because it's an infrastructure asset, the CCO, that is kind of to align with that long-term nature of that asset of investment.
Catherine, you said that the dividend is used to pay down debt. What do you mean by that? Do you mean pay interest or literally retire the debt? Because it looks to me like our interest bill is about double what we get for the dividend. With the dividend, we get a 7.5 million.
It
doesn't make 12.8.
What about the interest?
Our interest payment is at least 30 million.
It doesn't pay the interest, it pays the capital.
Okay, so we retire the debt.
Yeah.
Well, loan repayment.
Okay.
Currently, we're using it as the slide says for weather tightness loan. So we're paying that loan and we're repaying waste management because currently we can't develop contributions policy, get growth funded through the development contribution. So we use that for the waste.
I think, having a really direct relation to rates is, I think, changes the conversation. And we're always trying to provide value because I was doing off calculations across the 36,000 resident units. Queenstown Airport gives every ratepayer $400. Wanaka Airport takes $20. Tourism costs us over $1,000 per ratepayer, 1,111 average. And so I think that story is a really interesting one as a ratepayer to go, wow, I really value that airport. And also it's really important that, Wanaka probably pays for itself, but it's $20. And I think that really contextualizes all these big complicated numbers into where the money's actually going, which I think for people is, one of my vision statements is people understand what they pay for. And I think getting that story right so people feel solid around the investment that they're making every year into the district that they live in, I think is a really crucial part of how we do the rating system.
But to be brutally honest or cynical, it is just optics.
Yeah, I mean, everything's perception. What were you doing? I think like,
You know,
Well,
we make these decisions
distance
all the time as homeowners of various things. Is if I won $20,000 in the lotto, I would go, what's the best thing I can do? Do I spend it this year or do I put off my mortgage? And you know, a smart person will put off their mortgage, but you know, it doesn't mean that it wouldn't like a nice holiday and a new car. But it's you know, you've got to. Yeah, we just got to work out.
The people right now living here are experiencing what the airport does to them, and so they should get the benefit of what the airport provides. That's my. We have to live with the visitors, so we should get what they provide, or the one positive.
Yeah, I think, although I'm a little bit uncomfortable about using it potentially to offset water rates, well, it's easy for me to say.
No, it wasn't.
Good.
Our water rates are going up.
They are going up. So I too was surprised when I came into this time on council, Catherine, that how it was, and including a certain debate during a mayoral election a couple of elections ago, where it was stated, you know, by one that no, we can't. That's all we can do. And I know. Well, a lot of stuff we can.
To be fair, that's what we were told.
That's fine.
That's what we were told.
I mean,
Whether it's true or not.
So
we're talking about options
yeah,
on the table now, which is very good.
So I think what we need to do is keep the options open. We've got a statutory ability to be flexible on what we do with the dividend from our biggest earning assets. And we should use that ability to offset, particularly when we have years like this, when our communities, although some tourism operators are doing very well at the moment, but their costs have gone up as well. So everyone is, so we can, if we have the flexibility to say, well, this year we're going to adjust it a little bit because it's going to have more advantage for our communities. In other years, yes, we'll use it to just pay down.
I think it's fairly clear. Some nice alignment that we've got an airport that might be offsetting. Sorry. Just related, but it might not be something to talk to. The value of the Shallow River concession, is that something that's publicly
waterways too?
Yeah. So I mean, again, that's another example of where some tourism is actually paying. Yeah, some sorts. Okay, so that's sort of that's a sort of circular.
There's a skyline distance. Yeah.
You get a break.
We're good. We're on a roll. Let's keep going.
Okay.
Unless anyone needs a break. So.
Really? But it's a tax. Everybody knew that. It was a tax.
And we get taxed on the tax.
It's New Zealand's only real capital gains tax.
And so, like your income tax, not always the money is spent where you want it to be spent.
No kidding.
Yeah. We're pretty clear about capital revaluations and how that works. So the next one will be post the LTP. So it won't really affect us. And the myth busting comment on the slide was that just because you've got a revaluation doesn't actually mean you pay more rates. It just means your share of the pie rates will change depending on what your capital value did to the average. A whole couple of that, but yeah. The other thing that I find really interesting is in the Local Government Rating Act. These are all the entities that don't pay rates. So very few people that are left to pay rates. Just so that you knew that. This was a table
that's bigger than one stage if the Crown had to pay rates on the Crown land in our district, or be X proportion better off as well.
They do have to pay fixed charges.
Yeah, they do. So they have rubbish collection, they have to the rubbish.
But yeah, this thing Phil Goff is pushing back on in terms of local government reform, because it's like BS, they give a shit because they're still charging 15% GST on rates and they're not paying rates on their own. Two things alone would make the most significant difference at anything. So the answers are there and they can be solved.
Mind you, but yeah, I mean, it's a paper exercise, I suppose, but if the conservationists don't get to pay rates, we'd all be in trouble because it's 30% of the country.
This was just a table that's in our document that goes out there.
Yeah.
Thing. Yeah. And there's a little cheat sheet in the index as well. We're going to go right down to the detail. How rating all works. But the just next couple of slides are just explaining the different types of rates. Anyone got any queries about how
A little bit on the soup. How do you say it? Firstly, is it
Yeah.
soup?
Yeah.
Nice.
You've got it.
Sounds Norwegian.
Yeah.
We're talking about, I guess, some of the stuff I've seen come through is the new policy around granny flats and whether or not we have a strategy on how we're going to do development contributions and what our sort of view is on that, density strategically versus these sort of separate rates and where the discretion lies. I don't know if, just if you could speak to that or if you feel like that's a piece of work that could be included in the LTP or.
I think most of this applies to water, is that right?
Yeah. I guess
Storage.
the term granny flat is something that we're grappling with, and I know that these conversations have been around the organisation about how we would manage it from a rating perspective, what that means, what is the trigger, because they're not requiring a building consent, but I do understand they require a PIN, so that could be our trigger from a rating perspective. We've also in our district plan
Contributions still. That still pick up development contributions,
correct.
so it's
Yeah.
that would trigger the rates. But
From a, I guess it's water's a bad example because it's not going to be there anymore. But if you're looking at the impact of 2-bedroom house with a 1-bedroom flat, versus a 3-bedroom house, the use, is there an assumption that the use of services are double?
Sometimes, yes. So it's about the definition of the SILIP, kitchen, bathroom, separate entrance, and a certain size.
it's
That's
interesting.
by the district
I
plan.
gather that Dunedin, in some cases, do by the number of toilets, or because they've got all these boarding houses and things like that, and we've got a problem like that here as well. Is that it's really hard to distinguish. There could be 5 people living in a granny flat, but they only pay a 0.5 rating unit and a 0.5 development contribution. So,
But we also figured out through.
but the point is, there's still, there might be 5 people in that one, but there's 2 people in the house. So that's got to be. I suppose the point I'm saying is that I think we miss a few. Yeah, we need to explore different options around how we, whether it's floor area, whether it's number of toilets, number of something else to determine the capacity which they're creating, because clearly 0.5 isn't enough to pick up the true cost of most granny flats or secondary dwellings. And equally, we've got to be careful. The other thing I was thinking about was connection charges. Sorry, not connection charges, but the difference between rates we pay on connected properties that are available to connection and those that are connection, because that's disproportional to the amount that it's cost us already, because the capital cost of making it available is the primary cost. The operational cost is relatively small difference between those two. And equally, the amount of money that we've put into servicing a 5-hectare block to its final capacity versus whether they've developed it or not is irrelevant. We've already put the capital cost in to putting the pipes and the service there. Whether they're connected to it or benefited from that yet is irrelevant to us, because so we've got to find a more equitable way of splitting the rates up as to how we've incurred the cost rather than whether they're benefiting from it.
I guess you could lift the layer up from the target of nature, have a more spread across the district. Pick that up.
And at an extreme level, you'd be charging quite a lot of rates on zoned undeveloped land, which is an incentive for development, which is good. And they wouldn't also then have to pay for development contributions because they effectively prepaid them or whatever, because not necessarily development. There's a component of that might all be picked up. So I think there's a way that we can I don't know, some one of the things I think we need to explore in the policy when we're moving forward.
In the review.
In the review, because yeah, I'm just not convinced it's that area. I think the de facto the 70 square metre granny flat is a 0.5. This doesn't really make sense to me. I think it's more like a 0.7 or a, you know, because they're still likely to generate the number of almost the same number of vehicle movements. They're probably going to produce a similar number of amount of water used for flushing the toilet and doing the washing, you know.
I guess volumetric charging, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Would, well, you know, if you're measuring what's used, then that's
Bit flush.
yeah.
Well, actually will be so.
It's like do it to your neighbour's fence and the.
And that would be, I mean, I guess, you know, because it's something that people talk about, that would be something purely in the remit of the new water services. Yeah, that's not a policy on water metering. Wouldn't be something that we would.
I think our policies need to tell them how to, and particularly funding and financing, is our policies need to help tell them how to distribute the cost, and they then have to distribute them. But
somebody at
I
the back of
don't
the
think
room.
that's- From a policy perspective, our policies are about our revenue and how we finance. Our opportunity to influence the water services CCO is through the statement of expectations.
But the statement, we have that already, but
they
the
have
statement of
economic-
expectation can say, and you have to adhere to all these policies and stuff.
Not inconsistent with the economic regulation. So the intent of the economic regulation is to ensure that the costs go to the right places. So in terms of propane growth, in terms of, and in fact, volumetric charging by its nature is designed to ensure that the people who use the water pay for using the water. So it would, so their whole, a lot of the policies of the water services CCO will actually be driven by the economic regulation regime. So I wouldn't expect our statement of expectation should be directing them at a financial policy level. That would probably be, that'd be getting down into an operational layer, but that could be something that we can pick back up again in the statement of expectation conversation. These conversations are about our revenue and our financing budget.
I mean, I'd always understood that we'd be able to inform them through some level of policy, through a development contribution or whatever, but I mean, I've always pushed back a little bit on volumetric charging because I do fear that it loads our permanent residents with more of the cost, and it would take away from a holiday home. The holiday home owners would use less water, so they would pay less proportion of the cost, and we also wouldn't be able to recover as much from growth.
But that would be a decision for the water services CCO to negotiate with the economic regulator.
Yeah, and it defies the growth, pays the growth principle, but because growth might not be using the water yet.
So they'll have to do it in a way that achieves all of the outcomes of the economic regulation, but that'll be up to them to determine with the regulator.
It says their conversation later.
Yeah, and I told you that the UAGC currently is $287 per rating unit, and that's the breakdown there, just for your interest.
Does that mean Glenorchy Airport's making on it?
Yeah.
Glenorchy! God knows how that's.
But it's not supposed to, I mean, all the discussions we've had. It's to check that, because all the discussions we've had is that it's not, so.
So
The committee.
remember, this is where the revenue and financing policy, you've deemed that it should be funded by UAGC. So it may be that it's part of.
Yes.
Right, yeah, that'll be it.
So it's not 100%.
Yeah.
But I detect some angst about what we call those suits, that whether they, because I was discomfort about granny flat, and I don't think it's all appropriate. Some local authorities are quite happy to, because that's essentially what they're being used for. But in this case, it's certainly not. And it's so much.
Yeah, accessory dwelling.
Yeah.
Well, the district plan defines it as a residential flat.
Okay.
They're all written in legislation as a granny flat as well.
Yes, there are.
What other aspects of the policy do we need to look at? So the depreciation side of things, like everything that's in here. What do you need some early guidance on? I'm just
I think it's just coming back to, we'd like to make it simpler. Remove some of these differentials, you know,
I'm looking at the guidance around, so, page 337, capital expenditure due to renewals, list of depreciation, one of the policies the council has accepted it's not reasonable to fund depreciation where a community has funded a water or sewage scheme by lump sum contributions or loan charges because the community ends up paying twice. Is that too simplistic? Should we pay depreciation on some parts of the
Again,
assets?
we're not having water, so we won't need to roll that.
Yeah, but we've got it for, we're not going to go, so we don't need to write that since you're down. Yeah, okay. Are there any other aspects of it that we need to be taking a look at? Depreciation of other stuff? I'm just thinking of the detail of the policy, or is that coming back at session 7 or beyond? Yeah, okay, that's great. The only other thing I was sort of wondering, I'm just trying to get my head around the whole LTP steering group program, and we're doing activity plans, and I'm still not quite sure exactly what those are, but they sound great. It would be good to get a list of the different activities that we're going to be covering.
Provided, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, okay, great.
It's very similar to the existing.
And if we were to set some sort of direction early on about wanting to find certain levels of savings or additional revenue to reduce OpEx, how would you then go about presenting the information in those activity plans? I guess my overriding concern is that we're going to be doing bits piecemeal and giving direction without an overall direction that helps guide us through those discussions and guidance provision. So if we were to say, find 10, 20, 30 million dollars in either reduced levels of service or increased revenue from different. If we gave you that direction now, would that then change the way things were presented in the focus?
I think you've already given us direction that you want the rates to be within the rating cap range to 2%. We will be thinking, when you're presented with the activity plan, you need to be thinking about that in the back of your head as well, going, if this particular activity is going to have a 10% rate increase and someone else has to.
Something else is.
The difficulty in it is we don't understand the bigger picture. Again, we're starting with the smaller bits and the chunky stuff will come later. We can't solve that. Well, in terms of the review
of how much that activity costs. So there's a bucket.
Yeah, but in terms of, suddenly we've done a review of our policies and we've decided that we can understand where growth isn't paying for growth. And actually, if we change that, it changes.
I think there's some iteration as we go through.
I agree. I'm just
complexity there.
Yeah.
So I think if we could bring the activity plans out, they can then go away and come back again if they need to.
Okay.
It's I take what you're saying. Sometimes it's top-down view and then you get into the detail. I think the activity plans, we might be exposing the detail and going bottom-up instead.
We can come back. Yeah. So I think that's fine as long as that's
not
possible.
a one-and-done conversation. Part of the purpose of bringing the activity plans at this point is so that you have a good understanding of what the activities are, what they're delivering on, how they're delivered in terms of staffing, external contracts, service contracts, all that kind of stuff, and the levels of service associated with them, so that when we have the big picture conversation, you have that context and you can then say, you can then consider, oh, okay, well, if we need to pull a lever, where do we want to have further discussions? Whereas if we start up here, you've got no context below that of what that revenue goes to and what it delivers on.
I think it's also quite good for our newer councillors as well, who might not have had any direct interface with some of those activities, may not even know it's part of what council delivers. Just kind of creating a real baseline.
So it'd be quite good if we could structure it in a way that, and you do often do this, but what do we need to know and what might change, and try and guide it. Like today was an informative session, and personally I was like, oh crikey, we don't have many of them. We need to start providing guidance for the bits that come next. But I guess it's useful. I just think a little bit getting the structure right is quite important for the.
And there's the activity plans, but there's the differentials, which is the key thing, which is another. It's a multidimensional, because it's not only what do we want to do, what can we afford to do, but who pays for it and where do they pay for it? So there's and so that is that loop.
And
And,
where else can we find revenue?
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing that we haven't talked about is,
Yeah.
you know, how can we go away and find another 10 mil?
that's further down the list today. Yeah.
And this is the opportunity, these activity plans is about looking at the OPEX, because we wanted to see the OPEX. This is-
We do,
this is how
yeah.
we're thinking.
Absolutely. No, we haven't, I'm not saying
Before
before
we
we do
do
it,
it,
I'm just wanting to make sure it ties together.
The
Well,
intent is today to talk about the levers that are out there, so that when you're looking at the activity plans, you can actually suggest, oh, maybe we could fund this through X or Y. So this should map across to that.
Yeah.
This is the high level, that's the detail, and then we'll probably bounce between the two a little bit.
Sorry, in terms of these levels, this UAGC looks like pretty good levels, right? It's pretty basic. I'll just call it a flat tax or a poll tax, right? Okay, fair enough, flat tax. And if I look at this 9 million number that it's dedicated to, it's per year 35,000 ratepayers, it's plus or minus $10 million times $207 million, so $207. But then this whole designation, I mean, I'll be sort of I'll pretend to be an angry taxpayer. So I'm sitting down in Gibbston, I'm paying for the Glenorchy Airport and the cemetery in Monica. Why doesn't it just go into a general revenue pool?
This is your choice. This is what you'll be able to decide.
Right, okay, I get that. Okay, so it was just one of those old decisions.
As you go through each
And I
activity.
think this transparency is obviously the other principle we're trying to achieve. So a big part understands what they're paying for. It's a loss cause as well.
Yeah, okay, I mean, to me, it makes more sense to go in a general revenue pool, but if people want to see if it goes to a certain cemetery or airport, I get that. And then, like $287. That looks like a very basic, good lever that we could increase or decrease completely away from the fact that it's one of the highest in the country. It's actually fairly fair and fairly transparent, right?
That's up to you to decide and to then consult with the community around.
But if you could play God and you could redesign the same, wouldn't you be using that UAGC? Flat tax, poll tax?
Depends who you want to pay. It depends who you want the value to be the driver, or whether you want an equal tax.
This is the
Yeah, but it's the base case per head makes sense to me.
But
this is-
It'll per rating unit. we
No,
can't
for
do-
rating unit, I'm sorry. for rating.
But this is that comes back to this, you've got a very big expensive house and you can afford to pay more, should you be paying more because it's on capital value rather than a fixed charge regardless of whether you live at a $15 million mansion at Closeburn or, you know, a 60 square metre house at Frankton. They're paying the same, so potentially.
Then the last little thing is, and I know that I probably shouldn't say this in a public forum, but in terms of gaming the system and the fact that we've got this rate cap coming up, does it make sense for us to get a number of different things, including the UAGC, as high as possible so we can stay underneath the newly imposed 2%?
It's still a rate.
What?
It's still rates. So it's still included in the.
Okay.
I'm not
But
sure.
yeah, just in terms of the 30%, only 30% can come from the UAGC.
Oh, no, fixed. So fixed charges, there's at the moment lots of user fixed charges, there's lots of the governance fixed charge, there's, yeah, portfolios, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I think to your point as well, it's like pulling back again and go, what kind of district do we want? Do we want a district that's impossibly hard to live here and work? Or do we want a district that, you know, because currently it's like, if you're successful elsewhere, you can come live here. But like, if you actually live and work here, just wait 18 months and you won't be able to afford to. So I guess it's like aligning it with the outcomes as much as what we're trying to do.
Do we have examples where other districts have more closely aligned to capital value? You know, so that the high value properties really do pay significantly more than the others. Do we have any examples of it?
I'm sure we could find something.
I'm interested to just see how far has that gone?
It works really well when you've got a city where it's relatively average around the same capital value. Where you've got pockets where high value,
And
you know, for example, rural properties, a lot of them are, you know, a higher value.
Yeah,
And then for you're pushing quite a bit of burden onto the rural community.
yeah.
So
But the commercial properties is one where usually the higher value commercial property, the bigger the business, and therefore the bigger the rates should be. So you know, I think that's one area where we need to consider, changing that balance. I mean, the one that absolutely shocked me when I realised it was that a large hotel on Frankton, and this is regional council, but a large hotel on Frankton Road pays exactly the same for the transport targeted rates in Queenstown as a single house. And it's like, oh my God, that is unbelievable, you know? And so there'll be examples of that. While, you know, we don't charge, I don't know what the direct example is, but there might be fixed charges where hotels pay exactly the same as the house down the road. And that's not fair, because they clearly are a bigger business. They clearly have having more impact on the overall infrastructure and service provision.
Problem you may never hear of, because they're not going to come to us saying we're not paying enough.
Although they are though, when there's some are saying that, well, if you bring in a bid tax, then it's got to be at a fixed amount, because we don't want to pay at 5% of our capital value or the revenue, because we're already paying, probably the same hotel on Frampton Road is paying $300,000 in capital value rates anyway. So we got to look at, you know, what is it we're looking at as being charged for? What are the activities? Because there are tourism operators and other businesses in the district who have little land and investment in that, but they've got a huge asset base, which is all of their equipment that is making significant. Not picking on you, Matt. Sorry.
Share my rates.
Make a significant amount of revenue to tourism, and it does contribute to local economy. We don't get a slice of any of it.
Or even worse, some of them are making money on public.
There we go. Good point. So I'm looking forward to that review for us to get into that in some detail. Yeah.
It will cover all of this. It will bring up options, and will we be going out to the community and saying, right, here are some options?
Yeah, so revenue and financing policy is required to be consulted.
I know,
And we need to have options in that consultation document.
I guess I'm thinking about because at that point it's too late. We will have done all the figures to change your revenue and financing policy. So to me, that's one of the policies that needs early engagement to kind of support our decisions. So I don't know how you fit that into the timeline, but if you come back, have a workshop on that policy, work up some options, and then go out for some feedback. It doesn't have to be consultation. You can do consultation. It's a bit weird, isn't it? Because the actual consultation probably we can't change too much, but
yeah, I think the current timeline is August and November. It's when coming back consulted on revenue.
it's quite late. Is there any way of doing it earlier? Because you'll be wanting to be with the auditors and
We need to know what quantum we're trying to disperse. So we need to know how much we're trying to obtain through rates. So then work out how to, it is, yeah.
Because I guess it depends what, again, it comes back to what is the scope of the review, because are there two pieces to this? Are there the early options, and then there is the developing it given where we've landed? You know, if you need to know the figures, it's too late, because our decisions are going to inform the figures, but our decisions, we need what's coming out of that review. So
yeah, obviously we've gone through the principles and the framework in the earlier session, and then we can sort of overlay. This is generally what we're looking now with the numbers coming out in November.
yeah, that's I'd like to see the scope of that, because I do think
But
it's
remember, we're just trying to get you a document before Christmas. So, you know, you're going to come back in January and February, still going to be tweaking with things and still be.
yeah, but I've been through two of these, and the stuff that's done now, that's why I'm sort of slightly anxious about it. The stuff that's done now is what matters. It really shapes it. It really directs it. So how do we, if the review is requiring numbers and we're developing the numbers and the work we're doing moving up, it would miss the point.
So, for example, you go, this particular activity, we don't want to do this anymore. There's no point of doing the work on how to fund that activity, but we're now taking it away.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is there's another piece of work, and I'm not sure if it's captured, which is the big opportunities. And I'd ask you what they are now. Given our revenue and financing policy, given our development contributions policy, what do staff think are the key opportunities that we haven't been doing well in the past that we could change, that could fundamentally change what we're collecting in DCs.
On top of it, in the next slide.
Yeah.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
we need to talk about that too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what do you think they are?
Well, on the DCs, you're getting all the projects and you're getting the cost driver breakdowns, right? So you're seeing what proportion is going to be funded from growth. Okay, you'll go through all the projects and you'll get to see that, right? So that then goes into the DC.
But again, we're in a little bit of a rush. It's not that far before December, January and audit. So given the policy, I'll give you an example, something that we've raised in the previous session is why is visitor accommodation paying 0.3? And this is water, so just think of it as a concept, but why is it paying 0.3 of a dwelling equivalent? And the question was, is that because the hotels aren't full all the time? And the answer I got back was yes. So then the question is, well, but we have to cater for them being full. So they should be paying 1.8 if you're assuming there's people. So that was one of those big, like, oh my goodness, have we been not collecting, enough to cater for the infrastructure that these guys are, driving, because we have to cater for the peaks for wastewater in particular. But there might be other opportunities, like, they're not catering for premier sports grounds, or, they're paying a small amount towards other. What are the key opportunities? Have staff looked at their DC policy and gone, actually, we can see we're not recovering enough here, and here. Or have we just not done that work?
Based off the list of capital projects, there are some principles that you say, and that's all up the.
But the thing is,
We're not going into that detail.
no, we're not. But we should. I think the thing is, we know we're going to, because the second Quentin has been asking about this for years. We've been talking about it. We raised specific examples. We're getting into the LTP process. We need to know this stuff because we need to know whether there's really obvious signs in the differentials within that are behind the way these DCs are calculated.
Yeah.
If they're not right, if you can see they're not right, because you work with this policy all the time, we need some feedback on what's not right to understand what opportunities might fall out of that future review.
Really interconnected. So we have a visitor differential, so on accommodation and mixed use properties. And at the time that was put in, I'm assuming that the DC policy was aligned with that. So, maybe it's not as relevant now, or we just need a bit of whole review. We just need to, they're all connected to each other.
Again, that's coming in November, and
No, August is going to be
that one's coming in August.
Yes.
I think to come back to where we were talking earlier, what is the hole that we're trying to fill? With the action impact of visitors, what is the gap where growth isn't paying for growth? And we've had that every year in our long-term plans, where the annual plans, where the income from growth and the expenditure growth, and there's a gap in the middle. So that quantifies the hole that we're trying to capture. So maybe the I guess the ask of this session is, looking at with your knowledge of the tools and with the infrastructure team's knowledge of how we invest and what we're paying for, how do we come back to council with some certainty around, well, if you do this, or if you look at this, or this is the best option, this might be a way forward, that we're going to try and best cover those gaps. I think that's sort of, and we can look at it from our side, and many of us have done, and had the questions that Nikki or John have asked in the past. So
a bit more guidance on that.
Yeah, a big opportunity is the first development levies.
Yes.
That's going to change a bit.
Yeah.
That our fundamental assumptions about what the cost is still need to be right, and I think some of our DC issues have been because we haven't really daylighted the true cost of growth. So and I don't know enough about the development levies there to know that that's going to be answered. So
yeah, and on that point there, so development contributions, just the cost recovery for that growth, right? So you'll get a listing of all those projects. I think where you're going, Nikki, like with the land use and differentials, all that'll come through that revenue and financing policy. So it's quite they come together, but it's quite different in the process that we'll go through it, right? So the revenue and financing policy, we'll be looking at those differentials and then basically going into, hey, what's that portion you want to get from the rates element, or the total element that needs to be cost recovered? What do you want to get through that rates side and through the user pay side as well?
I feel like we just need a little bit of help with making sure that we're going to get the right things in future sessions in the right order.
You have a timetable of what's coming.
I know, but we can't
You
see.
have a context, first section here, what each of those workshops would cover.
Yeah. It's the interdependencies, I guess.
We'll do a little bit of that, see if there's a simple way to offer some navigation through it for you, a few additional points, because I think the challenge we've got is that a lot of it is highly integrated. You could end up with an absolutely crazy mind map that wouldn't actually help anybody. But if we can draw some threads through the main workshops potentially, sort of show the flow of some of those critical decision-making points and critical guidance
And
points.
make sure the timing's meaningful so that if we do need some engagement with the community or something, because engagement at the later stage won't be meaningful, then we need to fit some time into doing it.
I think it's, it will be meaningful because it will help ratify the position you've come to potentially. It isn't point out.
The consultation is not about ratifying our position.
No,
it needs to be
No,
about.
but I think
informing our
consultation is, the consultation at the end is meaningful, it is important, it will influence your decision making. However, there are points earlier in the process that is good policy making that will involve conversations with targeted groups, that may involve broad community discussions, and it will be done through a number of different forums. So we take that completely in mind. It doesn't necessarily need an early engagement piece, it's part of the policy design work. So we hear that loud and clear. It's really needed.
I think we need to look at the timing though of whether before August is a time when we can be discussing these key principles about is it behind the rating model. I think that's what Nikki's raising. So I think we just need to go away and look at that because I think we've presented that this will be, the reviewers will be engaging with council on this. So August is quite far through the process, is what Nikki's saying. So is there an opportunity for them to engage with council earlier on the high level principles, not the detail of where the cost goes? So I think we just need to go, we need to go and have a look at that and see if that's we can work that into the process.
Sounds like a good strategy, because
I think everyone in the room's across what we're trying to achieve. So I mean, I think that's the key thing. It's just that how we get there. So did we want to talk about the development levies, or we've excellent.
Well, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
We're working with Mike last time trying to figure out the difference between development contributions and development levies. And I think, at least what I'm telling people, I just need to clarify now. My understanding is that development contributions like hosting a party and then buying all the gear you need for the party, and then whoever shows up, that's just what happens. But then development levies are like charging every person $20 to come to the party, so that you've got, the amount of money that you have roughly, and then you can actually plan accordingly. The problem is that when we buy the food, buy the decorations, and more people show up to the party, that excess cost is then spread across the ratepayers, essentially. Is that too far of a stretch? Am I getting that right? But when you have a ticket to the party, you know exactly.
Gate crashes.
Yeah.
The safest option is not to have a party and do nothing, which is
You do make sure you get a license.
Yeah.
All
right. But a bit of time there, but
alternative funding.
Yeah. You want to come up for that, or yeah, it was just, obviously, rates is our last resort. We are looking all the time for additional revenue from any source we can. And these are just some of the things that are out there at the moment. And again, remember, we can't do a promissory note. They have to be locked and loaded before we can actually include them in the LTV, but, we are looking in these areas.
So some of these things, so the philanthropic donations contestable grant space was referenced earlier, and was that in the Smart Growth Committee? Might have been earlier.
Yeah.
And was, I think, falls somewhat into the promissory notes section and is actually used quite a lot by community services. So that's an area where they are always working to try and find those sources But unless they have secured them before we lock in the LTP, they can't always be reflected in the LTP. But that doesn't mean they don't continue to look for them to enable them to deliver their work programs. So that they're two sources that are alternative but not certain. So may or may not be actually reflected in the LTP when we get to it, depending on which bucket they fall into. The other things here are a lot more alternative and a lot more unsure, and are some of what we are exploring through the regional deal. So, for example, road pricing. Road pricing, so that's tolls or congestion charging are the two ways that usually shows up. Those are different tools for different types of investments. Congestion charging, for example, is primarily a demand management tool. So you would use that when you want to move traffic, make traffic movements happen at different times of day or on different routes in order to manage congestion. But it also does bring in revenue. Tolls are more used when you actually need the toll in order to pay for the cost of building the infrastructure. Now, those are not things that we should ever use on their own. So they apply in the transport space, and they should only ever be considered as part of an integrated transport program with an integrated set of funding and financing tools. And we don't have any plans to use those through the LTP. You won't see those because there won't be a future, where we have got to any certainty around that by the end of this year. But that is one of the package of things that we would be likely to consider in the future under the regional deal as part of the broader, how do we deliver the transport needs of the district? But they would only ever be considered as part of a whole program. You don't want to use them in a targeted way because they only fit with other things.
We would need to signal that, though, that it's a possibility in the LTP commentary and stuff.
Yeah, I think we did last time.
Yeah.
So there was a section in there in the financial strategy saying we will continue to explore other ways to get things.
I just suggest maybe if it's looking more likely that we'd be more specific and maybe even consider it in options, because we won't be consulting through the, I don't know.
If we were to use them as part of a future transport program, they any consultation requirements to do with that program would happen independently of the LTP, likely, because that program will have a certain amount of certainty around it by the time we get to the LTP, but we probably won't have the whole thing.
I guess my thing is, when do we get to hear the views if road tolling isn't mandated, but it's a consideration and it's signalled in our LTP, but we will never have.
Well, we can't rely on the revenues.
We won't know, but we could seek views, and we've done that on various things.
Yeah.
Like
I think we did on the last LTP. So we had a question in there about how willing are you for us to look at alternative funding, and I think this was given as one of the examples along with IFFA. That was one of the big questions that we asked on the last LTP.
Yeah.
So we could do a similar thing this time, but we did actually ask that at the last LTP.
Okay. It would be good to just have some feedback to help.
I mean, it's tricky because we're consulting on a very high level thing, and the problem, as I've always indicated with congestion charging and whatever, is we don't have a model that we're promoting for this district. We've got one report that says you could potentially box out the town centre, and that's the only bit of work we've got. And as I've said, the rest of it has serious problems around charging for discrete bridges, just charging for whatever. It's really hard to see how, in practice, how a model could work in our district. And I've asked that question a lot. Because it's tricky. It's more than tricky.
Definitely it is. So the work that's been done today was a proof of concept only. So it was like a little piece of work to say, what would it look like in this little circumstance? But as you point out, Quentin, we wouldn't do it without looking at it at a more holistic level, at a district level, and looking together with all the other tools. So what are all the other things that come together as a package?
Was part of it, whether public transport subsidies are maintained.
Exactly.
Whether residents
So, for example,
in Fern Hill have an exemption to get to Frampton.
Yeah. So you also wouldn't use a congestion charge, for example, if you don't have an alternative public transport. So that's one of the key principles. The infrastructure commission's actually done it. Not the infrastructure commission. oh yes, the Infrastructure Commission has actually done a really good paper on time of, these kind of charging mechanisms and the difference between the congestion type charge and the tolling, where they work and where they don't, and all of the things you need to consider. So there is a big body of work out there that would need to be taken into account.
And the reality that on the Queenstown side of the hill, that the most congested, most of the time, pieces of road state highway, which is somewhat of a challenge, even though we have a fast track applicant for a cableway anticipating they'll be able to access that sort of funding for their own activity. So it's an interesting mix. And if they did get that, would be way ahead of our LTP even going into place. So this is a contestable space now.
Yes, well, I mean, one would hope that any public transport on the road or off the road would be considered as part of a holistic system.
Ideally, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
for exactly the reasons that I've stated. So
yes, well done.
Yeah.
So going from the very high level,
yes,
suspended options,
yeah,
to the one thing that's always close to our hearts here is parking charges. So where, if we wanted to talk about, 24-hour charging, or so changing those fees and charges, or we've had the options of parking, potential paid parking over in the Luther. Where does that feature in our discussions along the way in this process?
Well, Petra and I have different answers to that. So while she finds her place, I'll give you my answer. Is that the parking strategy and our fees for parking should be tied together with that holistic view of the transport program as a whole, because what you charge for parking and where should be linked to where you charge to travel on the road, where you have public transport available, where you want people parking versus where you want people on public transport. However, from a revenue perspective,
the revenue and financing policy, we need to work out, how much you want to pay for by rates, or how much you want to pay for by user charges.
Yeah.
And therefore, that's the bucket of money that we have to collect to then determine what the fees and what the discussions
and
are.
whether you're parking back in public transport, or whether it's just there to recover enforcement, and whether it goes to offset something else.
So we might want to increase parking charges as a revenue source. So we might be, that might be your driver for increasing parking charges. But we need to do that cognizant of the fact that if we haven't put in place other mechanisms to enable people to not have to drive, which actually we're not in control of, then you get to a point where those might be unbalanced.
So that's a
TDM case, of course.
Rather than going in circles on it, how would we find out what could we raise through parking in order to work out what we could then afford to do, rather than trying to work out what we might be able to do and then how we get the money? Because there's,
in regards to the
afford to do in relation to what?
Short answer is
transport.
Well, we don't run public transport.
Well, not public transport, but actually transport, anything, the public transport infrastructure that we're responsible for paying for. So there is a reasonable amount that
Megan might be able to correct me, but I think when we first instituted the $2 bus service, we did support the thing through parking charges, into the service through parking charges, I think, to help establish the service.
Yeah. So we could always put up parking and then subsidise ORC.
Well, it
might want to run a school
question
bus
is what are the
service.
transport benefits, and
So,
as you correctly pointed out, it's a network view of the transport benefits. And, the problem we've got is that we're working a little bit in silo with ORC and NZTA and stuff in an integrated network. So we've got to look. I'm not saying we want to hand off money, but the point is, what's the benefit? What's the outcome? Not who's paying for it or whether it's who's delivering it. So
that all points to what I was saying about it needs to. They're all considerations as part of an integrated transport network plan, which actually is like we have it. Our transport strategy manager is just about to kick off. Together in partnership with ORC and CODC to consider the links into CODC. So that will be leveraging the strategic network plan that NZTA has largely done, but not yet.
As someone pointed out, because NZTA actually control the state highways, a congestion charge would probably be a joint arrangement with NZTA, and the benefits would probably be joint. That we wouldn't see all the revenue, so we'd have to
So the transport network plan will be working with all of those parties to determine, and that will bring in things like the parking strategy and things like that. But the complexity of that probably won't be finalised in time for this LTP. So, there'll be calls that you'll have to make without having, because it is a very complex picture and those parties are very difficult to get around the table at the same time.
There should be some level of working together. They're doing their LTP,
Yeah, there is.
we're doing ours. Is there a little team that's kind
Yes,
of working?
yes, there is 100%. And we're doing that actually through the regional deal is the impetus we got to get that group working together. There is the existing way to go. Tony was here. I know
Well,
we'll
there's
be
way to
watching
go.
that.
There's the PTAG and the TA, the Transport Governance Group, and all the different.
Those are all at a regional level. Way to go is our specific, specific for, I think that's Whakatabu, in fact, focus. So that is still operating, but what we've got is the next layer down in terms of the operational staff working in we've formed a working group across ORC, NZTA, us and CODC to be working that we've agreed the scope of the transport network plan. We're just about to go out for procurement to bring in somebody to work that up off the back of the strategic network plan.
A lot of these are relying on regional deal because obviously the government enables us, the politics to be able to do this. I feel like there are internal things that we could do that aren't in there. Like the last LTP, we changed development contributions to make much more upfront, made them much more expensive. And for example, in Hawea, Willow Ridge consented like 100 land developments overnight, essentially, because they didn't want to pay for that new upfront. So that was like policy that created an outcome because the incentive then drove housing availability and small things like that that don't seem like they're that difference actually drove a really phenomenal outcome, interesting outcome. In the same way, I feel like, in part of my growth statements around, growth enriching the community, tourism enriching the community, as opposed to currently both of those things being an inhibitor or, being a burden. Things like differential pricing where we are charging tourism and within our own ability to, but then insulating ratepayers by offering, a locals card or whatever. Is that something that you think is worth pursuing, or do you think the quantum of what we'd get out of it wouldn't be worth the effort put into it? I just think like sitting at this table and relying on government and there's, even with regional deals and coming back and saying, look, we'll make a promise, and half of that is like, oh yeah, we'll work with you in the future on stuff. So you've always been doing it. It doesn't feel very good.
So I think the things you're talking about is exactly what Catherine wants you to think about as part of the review of the revenue and financing policy. Those are the things under your control.
Right.
These are the other things that we could get, but we might not.
Okay. So all of that to go, yeah.
So when do we give that direction? Like if Cody's direction is something that we all think, yeah, we want to explore that more and have options. Do we give that direction to you now, and would you start doing it?
That's what we've taken away to come back to you with the timing of when we'll come and talk to you about that. Yeah.
So that's in the scope of the piece of.
It's a user piece of change.
We already had an extra look at a local.
And the idea was that I think that the more things that captured, the more.
Within our control.
So you're already looking at that, just to be clear.
Yeah.
So differentials for visitor accommodation or, things like that. It's part of what you should be talking about when you're talking about rating.
Yep.
How you
It's also the rec centre charges and the parking, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's all part of that discussion.
So,
should be.
So that will come back to us when that comes.
Yes.
With options.
That's what you'll be giving direction on. That's the point of
And
coming
there'll
and
be
engaging with
options that are feasible so that we don't get it and go, oh, well, it only covers this, so it's not really worth it. Will you give us?
Well, what we'll come back to you with is that were the action that Ian and I took, was to come back to you with how early we can come to you in that process. Because I would have thought we'd coming to you before the options to gather your views and input. But
Okay. Yeah, that would be great.
We haven't received they haven't even
provided yet.
The submissions from the provider yet. So I think there'll be some element of iteration. That's why we'll look at what is that going to look like for you and come back. The intent's never to bring anything in feasible.
Well, anything's possible.
Well,
Michelle's had the same. But Michelle's had the same email that I've had, from DQ just now, that Wellington are just setting a 2.6 differential for short-term visitor accommodation. That's what they've agreed that they will do. So, anything is possible, and we're not alone in having these conversations.
And the same problems, that's right. And there are pros and cons with all of this stuff. It's interesting, I love the conversation earlier there. So a regional deal, we have to do this work anyway, because most of the stuff that's at least in the region, well, even what we're looking at, but we can't. The Auckland regional deal that's been published, government would be doing largely anyway, and would be regarded as a promissory note that wouldn't pass audit for our LTP anyway, because who knows what's going to happen. So we need to do the best we can.
Yes.
And we can hope, but as has been said amongst other things lately, hope is not a plan. So, we need to build this in a way that meets our needs, and if there's some additional stuff, great. If it happens sooner, if it's the right thing to do, great. If it's happens sooner and it's something we didn't want to do, or is make things worse, we should not do that.
Yeah.
We've learned that from some recent activities.
Like all the stuff I just talked about with the transport network plan, that will continue regardless of what we get agreed to or not through the regional deal. The regional deal picked it off anyway
It has been pushed by the regional deal, which is good.
Yeah.
Just on the revenue and financing policy, this is this example here. That is what we will come to the first session. It's just challenging, have we got those funding principles correct? Is the right mix of private to public? Have we got, those fees funding mechanism? That's where you can see they're saying fees and charges. That's how the private operators will pick up the fees and charges. And the other one is that they're going to have a rate for fixed sports halls and libraries. So that's what will be challenging.
So you can't go through each one.
Each activity.
Because they're like,
Yep, 20 minutes. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. When you're getting your activity plans in the next 2 workshops, you really think about looking at that revenue and financing policy table and really going, okay, does that make sense? Have we got that right? And then you'll be prepared for the session.
Some of the levers I'm talking about, though, is more like, locals will pay $8 for the pools, but not locals will pay $15. There's $40 million to collect from tourism that we need in order to get back to zero, essentially. So I think that not differentials in rating, differentials in charges for user pays.
So
we talked about at the previous workshop.
We had this list here of the areas already that we're thinking of focusing on. So that's about that, adjusting that user split differential pricing.
Yeah, and again, is it, because I'm sure most councils will do the same sort of activities that we do. So in this scope of this review, is there any sort of what does normal look like elsewhere? If there is a normal, maybe there isn't. I don't
or
know.
To benchmark against.
Yeah, what would because we've got what tools is probably 80% general public paid and 20% is user pays. I think it's 80-20, something like that. So is that right? What's expected elsewhere? Because there's two things that we look at what we charge as a fee against others, but what we're not sure is what else the ratepayers are paying. So I guess that's the more sort of comparative information I think we can have, the easier it will help us to sort of land some of our decisions. So be able to say to our ratepayers, well, actually, what we're doing here is no different to what's happening in Macarville or Christchurch or sort of Rotorua.
With the visitors element will be different, but you'll be able to adjust for that.
Yeah.
But don't forget some of those big projects like were loan funded, so that future generations pay for those assets. So that's just another consideration too. It's not all being paid for upfront by visitor investors.
Yes. Yeah, I mean that's mainly the operation.
And the cost of capital.
But that's fed into OPEX. The loan repayment.
There's a relationship.
Yeah.
When we get those tables, could you put the amounts that we're dealing with alongside them? So in the
You'll get that with part of your activity plans.
So I'm talking about when we do that, because I thought you were talking about doing activity plans and then afterwards having a session on the percentage.
So that's the bit though that you have to wait till we've done the LTP to get. If you want it earlier, you'll need it.
No, I'm talking about an indicator. So what maybe the last year, what the amounts were.
So when you're looking at,
dollar spend.
for example, if you were doing resource consent, yeah, the dollar spend, so 20, 80, what's the actual amount you're dealing with? Because are you going to be changing the title? Not really.
Sure.
So
You're talking about $200,000.
why would we spend half an hour, waste half an hour talking about, yeah.
When we publish those plans, we're going to have some costings in there that will be based. I think we're basing it on the current year of
Okay.
That's close enough, though.
plan,
Yeah.
which we know
Okay.
will change, but
Okay.
it just anchors you in the magnitude.
Yeah, been really good so that we hone our discussions in on the things that will really make a difference.
Tennis ball, volleyball, Swiss ball.
Yeah.
It'll come back to the biggest thing being our lunches.
Don't get me started.
Should we carry on with the, yeah, let me see.
Right, so I wanted to just touch on, we've talked about the visitor levy, the local visitor levy a bit today already. What I wanted to do was just, there are actually kind of 3 levies in this space, and we've provided you with some background to this as well, because we've had a few different questions about this. Quentin, you asked about to get some information, so you could do some work with the MP, whose name I've gotten.
Well, Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph. And so we pulled that together and then thought actually it was probably best just to share it with everybody. So there are 3 visitor levies that are talked about in this space. So one is what we call the local visitor levy. This is the one that we've been advocating for since 2018. This is a bed tax on local accommodation providers. It's a percentage of the cost of staying in the accommodation. It was pitched at about 5%. It comes to us. We spend it on core infrastructure and services. So our core services and infrastructure that visitors use. So it would go towards roads, the pool, the event centre, etc. Yeah.
Rubbish.
Yeah. Rubbish. Yes, absolutely. And this is something we haven't had this. It's not a thing that we've ever received. Now this is it's something that we're advocating for under the regional deal. We've been asking for it since 2018. The national visitor levy is something that you will have heard being talked about in government realms. They're talking about the potential for a national bed tax. MB's doing policy work on it. We understand. We're not across the detail of that, and it's not on the current government's policy agenda. So they have said that they're not talking about it until after the election. They've also told us they're not talking about our local one till after the election. Publicly, so that's nice. And the national visitor levy is not, because they're still kind of working through the process, it's not set in stone. However, the indications are that that levy is about funding RTOs. It's about funding the regional tourism operators and the destination management activities, attracting people to regions, supporting those destination management activities, supporting events, those kinds of things. So that is demonstrably different to what we want from our local visitor levy, which is for it to go to our core infrastructure. And to be honest, the national visitor levy is what most other districts want from a visitor levy. That's what Auckland wants from a visitor levy. That's what QLDC would want from a visitor levy. But we obviously have very different pressures because of the number of visitors we have. We talked about it earlier, so I won't labour that point. But I just wanted to make clear that when those two get talked about, they are different. And so we would need to be really careful about what we advocate for, that we don't mix those two together, because actually the national visitor levy could just replace what we fund the RTOs and we get no benefit out of it. We, as in the QLDC, but also the residents of the district, in terms of being able to contribute to the infrastructure that our residents are paying for. So there's those two. Then we have the international visitor levy, which is the $100 that people pay when they come into New Zealand, which went up from $30 last year. That's a really interesting one because it was touted as being about paying for the infrastructure that tourists use. However, a big chunk of that fund went to pay for core government investment in tourism. So their core funding into Tourism New Zealand, etc. And there's only a very small pool that is actually then allocated, and it's split between tourism activities, and they're very clearly tourism activities, tourism infrastructure, so toilets at walks, car parks, freedom camping ambassadors, and to dock for maintenance of dock lands. Now, that hasn't been contestable. That's just been something the government has decided where that money will go. The minister has decided, with the exception of at the end of last year, there were some districts that were randomly contacted and said, do you have anything you would like to spend some money on in this space? And we put forward some ideas. So we haven't had confirmation about whether we'll get part of that, but that is not something that we've had access to in the past. I think in the paper there's a couple of examples where some of the pools of money that we have received small amounts from may have been funded through the IVL, but
yeah, the old tip funding.
Well, it's unclear whether TIP was funded by the original, that was tourism funding, but it was tourism funding. Sorry, it was a tourism investment fund. But it wasn't directly IVL. It wasn't technically the IVL.
The interesting with the IVL as well, originally it was supposed to be 50% conservation, 50% tourism related.
Yeah.
And that appears to influence somewhere along the lines. It's unclear as to where that's
and worse than that, in that it's gone into tourism promotion and other things that, and attracting business conferences and all this other nonsense that is clearly. But
what actually happened is they cut Tourism New Zealand's funding and then they replaced it with the IVL funding.
And DOG funding as well. DOG doesn't have significantly more funding, just funded it through different means.
Yeah, so one of the key things about the IVL is that as a general course of business, there's no path to apply for it. It's not a thing where you've got a path into it. And what they do put it into, aside from the massive chunk that they've put into their own the government's own ongoing operational funding of departments, isn't for ongoing operational anything. They're for one-off projects. And so
they've also been heavily politically driven.
Yeah.
So the person who got in the ear of Louise Upston or whatever has been successful in getting, and the example I've used numerous times is the funding of the bridge on the West Coast Wilderness Trail, and I presume it was Maureen Pugh or someone who was successful in getting in the ear and getting $1.5 million to support the replacement of a cycle bridge. Now, this is the bit that I've been saying we need to be in people's ears because, as you correctly point out, it's up to the minister.
Yeah.
They seem to have a lot of discretion over it, but it is politically driven. We need to make sure that we're in the mix on that.
Yeah.
Now, I note all those things are very valid that we've done with the TIF program or the TIF program and MB funding in the past is ambassador program or education, freedom camping and toilet programs. We had quite a good toilet program, public toilet program to build new public toilets and things like that. But I don't know. My point is we need to be ambitious on that. And the Skipper's Bridge is an absolute sitting duck for that because it's something that we can get a political champion for. It's something that has got nationally recognised. We don't have an alternative funding source for it, and it accesses the dock estate. So, I think we need to be way more ambitious in going after how we go after the IVL, and that's obviously what I've been advocating for around our messaging and stuff.
So I think that's what I'm trying to raise is that there is no path to apply for this like there was for TIP.
No,
for
but there's a
example,
way to go
this
after
is an area where advocacy from you to the right places
exactly
is how we get things onto that list. Accepting the fact that we have got this application process where we did put an application before Christmas, which is the first time they've done that.
Just bring it back to the LTP then, because promissory note discussion, So how do we signal a number of things?
So these are all things that we can't really signal.
Well, what I was thinking was the other way around. So
that we
if we
can
have a tourism promotion fund, and let's just say we have a discussion about that, and I don't know where that would land, whether we still want to do that or not. But if we do want to do it, and we know that the National Visitor Levy is in the mix, how do we talk about the ability to withdraw that through annual plans, future? Do you see what I'm saying?
With all of these alternative fundings, we're just flagging them as the reason for talking about them now is that we can't take them into account in the LTP. All we can do is signal that we will continue to chase them. And if we were to secure them, we would then need to potentially adjust something or not, because what we might do is add something.
Well, this is what I'm wondering is I don't want to have to do another long-term plan if we significantly change,
I wouldn't trigger a long-term.
Yeah, I know I get it, but there's no way to signal. No, there's no way to signal.
No, there's not.
I think the question is, do we have a placeholder in in the long-term plan that says if funding like IVL or LVL or NVL, collect the set, ILNVL, if these came along, this is how it would change.
We would
some of that
readjust.
spend. Yeah, so we might take the 4% of commercial rates out of our rates bill if that was replaced by national discipline.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Is how do we?
So what were those projects? But I don't know.
Well, the problem
So
is
the
for
question
the,
is whether
Skippers
you-
Bridge, we don't have a project in the LTP yet.
Oh, you might. You see.
We
I
might,
don't know.
but we haven't done a proper design case on it. We haven't actually developed a project because we don't know how we could fund it.
No,
So
but
there's a chicken and egg problem there because we're not chasing it because we don't have a pathway to fund it. So that's why we need to go politically after the IBL money, so we can then, get some indication from the paper and then go back and build it.
And I agree with you, but just back to that point about it's what if we were going to pull back on the RTO funding because there was a replicate that come along, would it be safe to put, or safer to just have some wording around, if other funding became available, we may backtrack on that. I just don't want us to be in a situation where we're getting funding and we're also collecting more money for the same purpose.
Well, we
For the
definitely wouldn't.
We wouldn't be.
We wouldn't do that.
It would be easy enough.
The question is whether, and we can take that away, whether it adds anything to the LTP to say what we would do if those things happened, rather than just bringing you a paper when it happens.
I wonder if
So,
there's a bit of
I think
scenario
we'll take it
thinking,
away.
high level scenario thinking that could be applied to this.
Yeah.
And the RTO funding, obviously, that is a collection of a membership fee. So it's,
Yeah.
we would literally cease collecting the membership fee if it'd be funded.
I know, and I guess my point is that that's quite a significant thing, and the RTOs may well be going, yay, we can double our spend, and we would, well, but they may well.
However, it
So-
is an hour rates now, so
But this is not right. It's a national visibility.
no, the
Index.
RTO.
Yes, I realise that. That's the point. Is we may mid LTP through an annual plan want to pull that back, and that's quite a big thing to pull back. So would some signalling make it easier to do that without shocking?
We can have a look at that, but I'm not sure it would add anything to the
I
LTP
don't
to do
know.
that. So
We can make some more-
That's cool. It's just a
we'll look
question.
into it, yeah.
I think that to speak to the skippers thing,
Yeah.
even if we had a two-sided high level, this is what we were doing, what our ballpark figure is. I mean, if we remember the discussions around the regional deal, if you want to talk about projects, you have to have had a bit of work done on something somewhere. And even when council bought that little bit of land next to the Glenorchy Village Hall, it's because there was a plan that had a bit of paper that showed, that being purchased. So just having some of that stuff ready.
Most of the ministers aren't even aware that we haven't received IBL.
Yeah, so
just
having
they
a-
assume that we have.
Yeah.
And they just do not know that we haven't had any access to the IBL.
So the skippers question, I'll come back to you on specifically, but that was one of the things we actually proposed that we applied for IBL money before Christmas. So we must have enough to have included it in that. So we must have a summary. But I'll have a look at that.
I mean, supposed to
It won't be a business case.
I
It won't
have
be a
asked this
business
question
case.
a few times.
But
And
I'll check.
if there's an application sitting on someone's desk that hasn't been provided to me, I'd be very surprised by that.
So that's been shared with everyone. We can share it if it hasn't been.
I have a quick and potentially silly question. Just interesting. If there's IVL, it seems like the intention was infrastructure, it wasn't used. Is there any legal accountability to say that they're misusing?
Because there's a word in the back of it, and other tourism related things, and they use that as a broad church to justify other and everything, despite it being explicit for what it was for. They use that tiny one line to justify whatever they want. What?
Local authorities and other organisations have taken previous governments to court on similar misapplication of legislation and usually won.
Okay.
So, because you go back to look at what the debates in Parliament and the select committees said it was intended for, it was deliberately not intended for marketing. So there's room there. If there were enough local, it would take probably more than one local authority to have the gumption to say, look, we would like to challenge the
Which is
government.
why we might need to raise it with the LTNZ. But it is fundamentally, and I don't want to understate this, as a misappropriation of taxpayers' money, of national money. It is absolutely misappropriation of money.
Yeah, but I mean, if we, what was sort of the precedent of other?
Well, the problem is there's huge political risk in doing that. It's not risk there. I don't think there's any risk in talking about it, but there is risk potentially in starting down that process. It has happened before.
Right.
I was involved in one. Very interesting.
Guys, we've only got like 45 minutes.
I think it's worth noting that we have an opportunity in
Yeah.
front of us to potentially move that conversation forward. So,
Yeah. In a more constructive way.
Yeah. So it'll be good to see where that conversation goes first.
IFFO?
Oh, IFFA. Again, this was signalled in the last LTP and was one of the things that was included in the question. This is something that we haven't done significantly more investigation on since the last LTP. We're just signalling that it is a tool that is available. Once we start talking about rates capping, it is something that that you may want to consider using. It's also something where the legislative framework has changed since the last LTP, and one of the changes makes it more usable by others, not necessarily by us, but by other parties. And it is something that we might want to consider using, for example, across a priority development area, as an example where we could use an IFFA to roll together all of the new infrastructure that we might be looking at, not just us, but that developers and the water entity, for example, might be looking at, so that we have a coordinated approach to what the cost of that will be. So this is an area where we need to probably do a piece of work. Patty and I have been talking about how we might frame something up there in terms of looking at what are the opportunities here for using this, and are they opportunities? Are they helpful to us? Are they helpful to residents? Because it's always just hanging there as a thing that could be used, but we haven't bottomed out the consideration of would it add value? Would it be useful? Would it help us and help our residents in the process? So that's a piece of work that we need to do. Again, the LTP won't reflect the use of this, but it's a thing that we will look at for future consideration.
And would you look at it in light of development levies? Because because
those two
the benefit just disappear given the levy.
Not necessarily. It depends how. Well, that's one of the things we need to look at is how they work together.
Because the cost of the financing was supposed to be higher, wasn't it, than what we could achieve?
The financing is different, so it's not as simple as it's
the cost is not
higher or lower. We don't know because we haven't investigated it.
All right.
It could be higher, but it could have other benefits because of the length of the borrowing, or the way it's structured, or the way the beneficiaries are spread, or that's what we need, somebody who's more skilled than us at understanding those impacts to give us some advice on.
It's not highly useful.
No, it's not. And that's one of the problems. You don't have very many examples to look at.
If we get them to do it, they'll look at it in our context specifically.
Yes. Yeah.
It is one thing that government's repeatedly said. LG said, well, we're surprised that not more of you are using this. We made it available and nobody's using it.
It's not easy.
No, it's not.
But the Queenstown Cowboy are definitely considering it as a mechanism to help fund their development.
The who, sorry?
Queenstown Cowboy.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It's one of, they've got so many options on the table for
They've
their
got
funding model.
a real interesting mix. Yeah.
Because that, I think from their perspective, that's a way it's a proxy for value capture.
Another tag.
Fast track IFFA, fast track around everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right.
Two last little policies, not that they're not important, but the rates remissions are great. We collect some rates, we charge some rates, but then we let a whole lot of people off.
How many?
So we do need to have this policy to have strict rules so that the team can be empowered to provide that remission if needed.
No, I
Just,
think,
some changes, ideas.
yeah, the policies are quite aged. I feel like there's a piece of work around looking at what other councils have got, making sure they're workable, making sure the approval steps are right sized, making sure that they're easy to administer, to make sure that the objectives are being met. So that's something that we'll bring back to you.
There's also the potential for the ratepayer assistance scheme to have an interface in this space as well, if that comes off.
I just on that because the RAS was brought up. Oh, wrong place. Wrong place.
I have a question, Cheryl. That's okay.
Yeah.
The ratepayers over the age of 65, is that a common occurrence?
At QLDC, no. Other councils do, and it just may be our demographic. We do get queries about it, but it's quite cumbersome, and that's something I'd like to look at to make it easier process for the elderly.
Sort of the government's DIA.
Yeah, the DIA rebates sort of plug a big gap for that.
Right.
So there's up to, I think it's $805 per annum that people can apply for. That's not just elderly, that's for low income as well. And now they've extended it to gold card users. We've had a massive uptick. I don't have the numbers on that, but so maybe that's enough relief for a lot of people.
There is some, there has been a bit of work done on, because a lot of people in that age category are equity rich. If they've got a fixed income. So what they are doing is cashing out their piecemeal cashing out their equity.
Yeah.
So that's taking care of business.
Yeah.
So that I remember we did have a discussion a few years ago about that. It's probably still happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a comment I get every now and then about affordability for people who are of that age, but then I calculated I pay more in income tax that goes towards superannuation than what I do in rates. So I actually running a little sympathy. Anyway, not to just undermine all of that. Obviously, it's a great initiative.
And the last but not least is the Treasury policy. And I think those are the changes that we're proposing. Obviously, water goes out, so therefore we're going to have lower debt levels. Anything else you want to?
No, we sort of talked about that earlier with potentially repurposing how we do our dividend repayments. And then a lever, I guess, that we have, notwithstanding the rates capping, is getting a bespoke arrangement with our GFA if we wanted to go up to 350.
Is this where our contingent liabilities are noted and discussed, and where we talk about how we deal with those?
At the annual report, as part of the audit.
They don't sit in policy anyway.
So it's like financial reporting.
I wonder if it should, because I get it once upon a time, but given that we've got the rates capping now, that whole landscape's changed, and there's a lot of discussion going on about it in the background with the rating agency. So
there's a financial reporting and it's full name Benchmarking Act, which prescribes what a contingent liability is.
yes, but in terms of daylighting for the community, how we treat these things and making sure that we think about the impacts on our credit rating and so on. It just hasn't been an issue, and sometimes now the landscape's changed. I just think we should give some thought to it because it may well impact our credit rating, and that has flow-on effects, obviously. So, just I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think we can just ignore it and treat it the same way we always have been, because it's a fundamental difference. We can't just raise the money to cover those things. So that they're thinking of it differently. I think we have to as well.
Shouldn't we get advice on that from the sector once the rates company actually comes into effect as well?
Yeah, maybe, but we need to think about it ahead of that because that's not finalised yet. We're working on the LTP.
I think that's something we can talk to the sector about.
Yeah, that would be great to get some
Are you
advice.
worried about a potential downgrade?
Yes, and that's what they're talking about. I sat in on this well, I didn't sit in. I got it the webinar afterwards because I missed it, but it brought up contingent liability and how that's treated. They actually had the RAS in the mix. that was one of my questions, but it came up independently. So they're thinking about all these things that are, you know, we may have to fund that we can't just anymore. Mike has always sat there and sort of said, well, it doesn't matter because we can always just raise the rates. We can't just raise the rates and recover these things. So we have to be more careful about the liabilities that we are potentially taking on, how they're treated, because even if they don't come to pass, but the credit rating agencies may, you know, and then that's going to affect our interest rates and that will affect our rates.
I'd flip it on its head. We can fund a lot more than we're doing. We can raise our debt levels a lot more than we are, and we've got a lazy, we got a lazy credit rating. The difference between our AA minus
It's not about whether we can't deal
and single A plus is about 5 basis points in 30 years.
how they.
But the point is, our whole balance sheet is going to flip on its head once we do the CCO, correct? And so our debt to revenues is going to go from 260 down to 100.
190, yeah, right.
Yeah, but the quantum.
And as a high growth region, we can still go up to 350, right?
Can apply. Yeah.
Yeah. So we could potentially raise a whole lot more.
Yeah, but the quantum goes down as well, so your percentage is higher,
But
but
the
we're
what
talking about a lower revenue amount, so therefore the debt amount comes down as well. And then you just have to compare that with what your contingent liabilities are. And so I'm not saying what matters, I'm just saying we should possibly have some policy around how we treat it and what we take on and what we don't, given our understanding of what the rating agencies might do. I just don't think we can ignore it.
But I think the thing that for me, look, I totally understand that the water's going out and the revenue's changing and whatever. What I don't still understand at this stage what that really means in terms of our capacity, and particularly in community services and stuff like that. So I at a high level, I sort of understand the principle. I just don't understand what it really means in terms of our capacity. I don't know if that's been communicated to us. And I suppose the size of the programs, or the used to different packages or whatever you called them before, that's still don't quite understand that what it really means.
There was a table, I think, in the last LTP workshop, which had waters and non-waters borrowing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get all that, but I just still don't quite understand what it means for our capacity for Simon's team, for instance.
Yeah.
And what can we deliver in our program that we either weren't or couldn't before? I mean, I still.
It's a good point.
Because you get that context.
And rating, for instance,
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the iterations in the LTP would have been constrained by the debt.
Yeah.
And I think that gets flipped around now, notwithstanding what Q said before about can you try to get us rates high as we can, because I think the constraint's going to be on the how much you get from rates revenue.
Well, the revenue will be the restrictor, clearly, because, and notwithstanding that, and that will limit us, that the rates will limit us by even how much debt we can take on in service because of the size of the debt cap. So, yeah, there's a lot of moving parts there, and I just don't have that picture.
So that work of the review of the revenue and financing policy and the rates model will impact the revenue side of things, but the cost side, obviously, rates are based on recovering costs. You'll recall that when we had the rates capping workshop, finance had modelled based on our current LTP. If you took out water, what were the rates increases? And they were quite minimal, except for one spike, and then went into negative. So in terms of the capacity for you to have
that's completely hypothetical, because I don't know what program that's based on. I don't know how much we're delivering to
that's based on the program that you agreed in the last LGP.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant now. That is completely irrelevant.
It is irrelevant now, but
because we're dealing with different assumptions. This is my point.
Something more tangible around the program and the.
I can't use that assumption anymore. That we're no longer based. Things are fundamentally changing. I can't. We know that we're under delivering in the last LTP, and we had to because of the financial constraints. We no longer have the same financial constraints. We have different constraints, and I don't understand what that means.
Well, when will we get something around that? So the same old rates and stuff that we always got.
Like you're going to see the capital program, which is going to be a big determinant of how much we borrow, because they're going to big to make that program. So once you've had that workshop, which I think workshop's but yeah.
I think baselining on the old LTP doesn't help me. And I mean, I really.
So the old LTP was based on so it doesn't matter what it's based on. What we'll be showing you this time is what we should be doing. Then you'll be making decisions about what you want to pay to do. That's the purpose of the next. Like you're going to see the activity plans first. You're going to see the infrastructure strategy, it's the 30-year picture. Then you're going to see the 10-year picture based on this is what we think we need to do. You can change that by making these choices to decrease it, and it will show you what the rates implications of that are. But
we have to start with what we should be doing, Ben, and I think under the old LTP, and
we didn't start with that last one.
Well, we did in a way. I mean, the community services program was a $300 and something $1 million program, was back to 120 million. Is that?
Let me tell you, we made Simon take out a bunch more, but before it even got to you.
I know, well, this is my point. But that was based on a needs assessment. They did the work in the background, but we still ended up, So I can't. It doesn't help me.
No, so you will see that this time. My point that I was trying to make is that you also will have to take into account the point that I think was made by Matt, which is that water is taken out, but water will still be charged to residents. So everything that you choose this time to increase above what we had previously committed will be an increase alongside. So if we previously had indicated an overall increase of 10%, or let's say 8% in the LGP, and when we took out water, that was -1%.
Well,
if you want to take that -1 to 2, actually the total increase is going to be 13. And so that's part of. So that's why we're going to be bringing you water alongside.
We use that constraint. We're in the negatives the whole time.
100%. Yeah. That's the context that you're going to be working at.
We're working within
no water's going to go up.
What's your baseline?
Yeah, what we're asking for is just information. And, we're banding around numbers like 190, 260, 350. And I'm doing that too. I'm just pulling it right out of my pocket. So effectively, if you want a snapshot or a balance sheet of last year's LTP, what it looked like with 260 AA minus debt and and debt ratio of 260, and then now what it's going to look like and how that exactly as you did with the pie chart of the water services off to the side just about an hour and a half ago. So we can see how water services fits the SCCO, and then how we fit what our debt to equity ratio, debt to revenues is, and what the constraints are around that. Because, for instance, we have the rate capping, so then we have to add water next to us because it has to be capped. And it's a simple.
Water isn't included in the capping, but that's exactly what you are going to see in that next phase.
Okay. Well,
so you'll see what we think we should be doing, which will show a significant increase.
Yeah.
And then the tiers down from that, where you have to make choices, and the rating implications.
Yeah, it's just one sheet of it.
It's a little bit more sophisticated than that. There's the stuff that we Sorry. Yeah. So there's the stuff that we're statutorily obliged to do. Stuff we must do, not should do.
Which was mostly in the water realm, to be fair. Yeah.
No, there's a whole lot of planning stuff. There's a whole lot of stuff that's significant cost. But so. Right. Thanks. Then there's the stuff that we're committed to doing. Yeah. It was an option in the past. It's now something we're committed to. There's a whole lot of that, particularly in the community area. Then there's stuff that we would like to do.
Yeah.
There's some other stuff that is optional. We should seriously consider doing. So it's more than just those two, isn't it? So we need to make sure that those things that we must do, we're doing really efficiently, right? Same with everything we do, actually. But we don't have, because there's a range of quality service levels against all of these things. So we need to consider the service levels. And then we think about the impact over time. Only then, I think, do we then get to think, well, okay, how are we going to fund all that?
Yeah.
Although funding does come into it, but it is a bit more complex than just.
We have boundaries also, and our boundaries are, we're going to have a brand new looking balance sheet. And I think I know in my own brain what it looks like. And I think you may have done it earlier in the table, but just make it simpler. And then the other thing is we've got a boundary is rate capping, a boundary is 350. And those are our boundaries. And so let's work within those boundaries once we know what the balance sheet looks like.
Quite, but even though the capping is currently still only notional, but pretty serious.
Well, still not going to abide by that.
But yeah, I mean, and you know, obviously debt's fixed to revenue, and revenue is rates, and rates is cash. But rates isn't the only revenue either.
True.
And I
That's
think
right.
that's another thing we need to be strategic around is leveraging the value of this district.
It's not as binary to say that rates is capped either, because as a high growth council and with visitor numbers that are double our, where our population doubles because of visitors, gives us two very strong reasons where if it was necessary and if you wanted to and if the community wanted to get an exemption to be higher than the rate.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point to work off, because on one way you go, oh great, we have all this tourism, we can now go more burden on the ratepayers than what was kept. But I'm saying that you would do that in order to create an asset that then would subsidise the ratepayers long term in order to ensure that they could.
But the exemption might be to have a differential rating model that charge a sector of our community more because they're the ones that support visitors. For example, as you talked about before, that could be the exemption that you're talking about.
Okay.
Or the parts that are growing. So, and
therefore,
so it's going to be a fun exercise.
Just going back to your point, John, that the problem, you're dead right that there are things we have to do, the things, whatever. The problem is our program was dominated by the things that we had to do. Sure. There was so little room for choice in the past. Now, this is the bit that, will fundamentally change, because we will have more choices, but we will have to prioritise the things that we deliver. Yeah. Now, that's going to be both a blessing and a curse, I dare say. And then we're going to have to look at revenue streams and stuff as well. So we're just so heavily, and most of them, to be fair, were in the three water space. Most of the must-dos were in the three water space.
Yeah, they were. Yeah. They were mostly compliance related.
Yeah, I mean, well, and a lot of the nice to haves that we'd like to do, they were just based at keeping up with levels of service because of population rate. Right. Yeah. They weren't these glorified projects that were, silver or gold plated. They were just trying to keep up.
Quite. So this LTP then, because of that, and because as I mentioned, the rates cap is almost not relevant for us. That this LTP is an opportunity, particularly with the water stuff going out, that we become more liquid, ironically, and that it's an opportunity for our communities to take control of their future. So what is it we want to do with this opportunity, with this growth that's there, with a sector that's not currently meeting and historically hasn't met some of the costs of its contribution to the local economy. So there's a real opportunity here to do something more.
There is opportunity, but not to be a Debbie Downer. You've also got, depending on what the election outcome is, the potential conversation around local government purpose.
Oh, totally. Totally.
That's going to come into play, and and I guess that's kind of smartly set up to say backing you off a little bit, because you might have this new kind of ability, but we're not recommending that you're spending dollars on these great widgets that you might like to have. So I'm just saying it is going to be challenging.
I had a conversation with Sam Stubbs at Terramea when we were talking about regional deals, and he was saying, because there was discussion around asset recycling and around, why does a council own an airport? And was sort of like, I'll buy the airport off you kind of thing. And I was like, well, you're not taking it, mainly because it's the only way to offset rates. And the irony is that the government's trying to have two conversations. Yeah. One is cap rates, and the other one is just go back to what you're doing. But then ironically, there's a world where going back to what you're doing puts rates up, or, which is why I'm suggesting all the incentives are driving us towards doing more commercial-minded things, because then it subsidises the revenue that we need to collect from ratepayers in order to pay for core infrastructure projects. That's just sort of been my observation.
Yeah, it's reality.
To further to Megan's point, the changes that we've got ahead of us, we are going to need to be more nimble, arguably, particularly in the first 3 years of the LTP. We're going to be making some decisions for this LTP for the next 10 years, not really understanding the implications of the simplification of local government, the future of QLDC piece of work, and the resource management reform activities. We have a little bit more certainty around water, at least in a financial sense, but it's still working through the implications of that. So I think this is going to be the mindset we need to go into this LTP with as an organisation, as a governance body, is how are we going to retain some flexibility? How are we going to be live to the changes that keep on flowing through for another couple of years? Yeah.
Is that easily done? Because like from a newcomer perspective, all I hear is, well, that's not the LTP, so you can't do that, or that's not blah blah, but the LTP is like this. If it's not there, you can't do it, or it is blah blah blah. So how do you be nimble whilst saying that?
Well, I think the reality is that culturally we're going to have to think about it quite differently.
Yeah. So it's only it's not like this big policy. It's just us saying no, it's not an LTP, or it is a policy, or
it would be a case of when we come to review at the annual plan each year, we're probably going to have a more fulsome discussion around, okay, what are the real implications of that? What do we know what's concrete right now? And keeping that flow of communication going between all parties as well.
I think it's also recognising that the first 3 years of the LTP is probably where we'll still be in our current form doing what we currently do. The things that are further out are the things that are where it's much more uncertain about what local government will look like there.
We don't want to be into the trap, as we were discussing earlier, and saying, well, that option's just not available. No, we can't do that. We need to be more open to say, well, what can we do? What are the tools available to us to make the most of? And might have been seen as hard in the past, but now we might need to go there and be more creative. And as we're talking about some of those of us who were earlier today, with doing a participative democracy approach to some things to get communities involved in doing some of that. And some of the responsibility for some of the things we're currently doing might sit somewhere else later.
Nicola.
I might have missed this, sorry, but if we change some of our finance policies and we say we're going to charge more for capital value, blah blah blah, and we change things, is that going to be reflective in the water services CCO, or they can do it? Yeah, that's why I was like, I missed it. Yeah.
Or the last slide, okay, was just to remind you that the water CCO will also have to have a lot of these same policies. And I think we talked about it earlier. There's one that's a little bit different, which is a growth policy. About what we know about what the growth policy. It's basically the accumulation of all our policies in relation to growth. So yeah, yeah.
Take it away, then.
Yeah, well, it's just sort of basically, okay, what's going to be informing our how we plan for growth, I guess. So that's that big alignment with the
the growth policy overlaps with the development contribution, development levy stuff as well. It's about how we pay for growth, as well as how you, because obviously the spatial plan is our plan. The growth policy is a policy of the Water Services CCO. There's not a lot of detail yet about what the growth policy is actually needs to cover, although it does need to be done.
But the point going back to my thing before is that whether we have they go after a flat development contribution or go after a sort of a scale-based development contribution, or whether they go after ambitious growth pays for growth policy or whatever, those things are really important to us, well, and to our ratepayers. So I mean, how do we inform those? Because we really want to, you know, as I said, reload the system to make sure they're paying their way.
Don't want to sound like a broken record, but the economic regulation is designed to make sure residents, users of water, pay the appropriate amount, that it's affordable, and that the other users of the system pay their fair share. So there's a much more stringent economic regulatory regime to ensure that the prices that are paid are balanced. So they will look very closely at the development levies policy of the water entity to ensure that there is the right focus on that, so that it's affordable for users, residents.
So would you say that the current situation in Luggett and like the small water communities, would you say that wouldn't have got passed because that would be like too high for not equitable for some people?
Not necessarily. In fact, it could have been the other way around. because it depends on what the principles are that the economic regulator will apply.
They might have already socialised the cost across the
Because,
district.
Yeah, they might not think it's appropriate to share the costs for one scheme with everybody else in the district. It might become more stringent in terms of this scheme needs to be paid for by this scheme. Don't know for sure because that hasn't played out yet, but that'll be something the Water Services CCO needs to work through.
Yeah.
It could go the other way. You could end up with one charge across the whole district.
So the other thing is that first line is that they won't be able to charge via rates. So they have to phase out the use of rates. They can't use capital value as a mechanism to charge. They'll only be able to use fixed charging and volumetric charging.
That's actually electricity companies.
On the policies that they're required to have, so a lot of it will be guided by the regulator, but will we have any say or influence or through the SOI or?
It seems to have given that up by the sound of it.
I think the significance and engagement policy is one where there is an opportunity for that.
Yeah.
There's some elements of some of those policies that will flow through from the statement of expectations, but the policies themselves generally, the whole point of the economic regulation is to ensure
that it's pretty strict.
And the development contributions, to get me wrong, it'll be we need to be integrated. So we need to have common integration in those two, our policies and their policy.
So it's interesting to see what's happened in Wellington already, with Wellington Water being called, their initial proposed charges called back by the Commerce Commission because they're deemed to be far too high. And now the shareholding councils are having to get together and go, well, what does that mean? What do we need to do to work with Wellington Water, what do they call themselves now, to come up with something that's actually affordable and is equitable.
So the whole problem with the model though is they'll be as high as they need to be to pay for what they need to pay for.
Well,
We have no control over that. And this is the whole problem.
But the economic regulator does. To John's point, they've gone, that is too high. What are you going to do to bring that down? And actually, the reason I think that the council shareholders are involved is because Wellington Water's new entity hasn't been stood up yet.
Yeah, fully.
It's actually not stood up until the 1st of July. Otherwise, that would be something the board is doing. Whereas at the moment, Wellington Water is what's called a management CCO. So it is a CCO, but the assets are still owned by the council. The council still controls its revenue and makes major decisions on investment. And that's why the shareholding councils are the ones who are currently drawn into that process, because the economic regulation has been applied to Wellington Water already. It was done early, but they haven't set up the full CCO yet. So that doesn't go live till the 1st of July. Yeah, so that wouldn't be usual that the shareholding council is the one being drawn into that conversation. That would normally be the board.
Am I correct? We're going to be the collection agency for the CCO, right?
Not necessarily.
Oh, they may set up their own group.
We will have a transfer agreement with services that we will potentially do a shared service or, and it may be that we do that.
But the question is, will it be on the rates notice or will it be on a separate notice?
It may be on it. It would definitely have to be on a separate
It
notice.
has to be on a separate notice.
So not on the same notice, but separate as water.
Obviously, there's some synergies.
One of the decisions to be made with the CCO is whether it's how separately it's branded from day one.
Quick, complete left field question. Thinking about revenue and things. What role is there with developer agreements to get funding for things that we wouldn't otherwise get funding for, or get delivery of things? Yeah, in that negotiation about, well, there's a potential upzoning there, maybe do something or work something or whatever. Have we used DAs for that?
We use heaps of DAs.
Yeah.
How do we show the value? How do we sort of describe the value that we can get from those?
The immediate value, I guess, is getting cash up front. And then we've got certainty of what's happening as well. It does commit us, so it has a balance to that. There's obviously BNI's got a negotiator and now looking at that for latest money.
When's that policy coming back to us?
So it's not really a policy, it's more of a guideline.
We did recommend a policy and I thought that was what council.
That
That
was
was, they're still working through what the optimal model is.
the development agreement policy that we recommended.
I don't know.
That work program is
Yeah,
still,
that work program is still working
underway, hasn't progressed significantly without you seeing it. It's part of, it needs to be worked through in part with the CCO, because the majority of the developer agreements we currently enter into are for water. And so part of it is working out which bit we need to be looking at, what bit is for the CCO. That actually makes DAs more complicated in the future, because we ideally wouldn't want the CCO negotiating a developer agreement separately to us when we've just put all of this effort into trying to get all of our internal departments together when we're talking to developers.
So that needs to go into our constitution. Something around there.
Not necessarily, that's just, there's many areas of work that we need to be integrated with the water services CCO.
The only thing I'd
That
say
is one of them.
The only thing I'd say is we've been doing a stock take of the development agreements. First of all, we've been finding them, getting them out of the drawers, and so we've now got them in a central repository. We're now going through those to find out what the obligations are and making sure that those obligations have been delivered. So that's been the first port of call, and then we'll start to work in on how do we standardise them, how do we, going forward, what's the next step?
Actually, we should have included developer agreements in that alternative funding slide, because if we have a developer agreement, it'll be reflected in the LTP.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of those significant projects that are in the LTP, particularly the ones in the priority development areas, the growth ones, there is no actual intent that we pay for all of those. So, for example, in the last LTP, we originally included an assumption that 30% would be covered by upfront payments from developers, and the auditors deemed that to be a promissory note, and so we made us take it out. But for example, those major infrastructure investments for greenfield development areas, I'm not sure that we have ever developed a greenfield area where we've paid for the whole lot. It's just that at the time we do the LTP, you haven't entered into that agreement. So by the time we do the next LTP, this is water. So for the water services strategy, for example, we may have developer agreements in the Southern Corridor and Ladies Mile that then flow through into those plans. So
I think we often have paid the infrastructure, but we just have recovered it through DCs, or at least that.
But the developer agreement is for the big ones. There is often a agreement where there's
how much did
and a different way to the development contribution.
How much did Longview pay up front towards the Upper Clifford conveyancing scheme?
Oh, so not every development. Sorry.
Well,
but,
okay.
And yeah, sorry.
If there's no policy, how do we ensure?
Well, that's not just for Longview though. So I'm kind of
but you don't ever do one piece of infrastructure for one, or very rarely.
So in the Ladies Mile to the Southern Corridor.
Okay, hang on. Yeah, that was a really interesting topic to raise. 5 minutes before everyone wanted to go home. So work in progress, but I think come back. Let's hear a little bit more.
Let's get the right.
Because it is part, and it's part of the mix. So yeah, and it's something that if we're aware of the value of those sort of things, when we hear that there's DAs underway, if they come to us for comment, we can just understand the context a lot better. But
looks like Dave's listening.
Okay, yeah. DAs don't come to council though for approval.
There should be guidance.
For
well, in terms of guidance or policy or whatever from a governance point of view, because at the end of the day, they probably represent some degree of risk to us.
Look, I'm happy to discuss developer agreements at another time through the chair, and generally within greenfield developments itself, internal infrastructure is paid for by developers, and the external trunk infrastructure is in portion paid for by the different developments that may occur, as Quentin was saying.
Thanks, Dave.
One last request that we do go away and talk to Fitch about how they're going to treat our CCO debt and how that's going to impact credit ratings. And
we have a session with them coming up next month. We can ask Fitch.
Yeah, it comes through in July.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
It's a staff meeting.
It's part of that. Yeah, we do an annual cycle with that. They always say our revenues, now with the rates being a strong revenue stream, that's why we've got such a high.
Yeah.
But now it's different.
Well,
And
still about. So,
yeah, but they have said, and this is our GNZ advice, it's our GFA's understanding that S&P and Fitch will consolidate water debt where a council owns more than 50% of the water entity, and I don't know what that means in practice.
If there's a session coming up,
Yes, it will, but
then,
if they're
then if
consolidating.
there's a session coming up, probably put your questions down,
Yeah.
send them through whilst they're fresh in your mind from that
It's
session.
really important for our figures and stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have anything?
I was going to say thanks for being so nimble because I appreciate it, and I also want to share the sentiment with Ken and your team. I know that was sort of Ken span in the works, and I was like really just want the opportunity to engage a lot, and that makes it quite confronting and nerve-wracking. But I really appreciate the chance for you to talk.
I might just close by just reminding you that we will capture the collection of guidance as we decode it. We have also picked up there's quite a lot of just specific questions that we've undertaken to come back on, and we'll put all of those into the guidance and the Q&A tracker, which will come out, should be out by the end of the week. So target. We have done a restructure of the folders to make all of the material easier to find. But yeah, thanks very much for all of the really open conversation, and I'd probably just reflect back that I think collectively we really are hearing the message around visitor economy growth, ratings models, and the need to bring that together into the subsequent workshops in a way that's easy to digest and absorb. So we will do a little bit of work just looking at the plan for the work for the upcoming SGs, making sure that we've kind of, now that we're sort of 3M, let's have a look at how they flow and make sure we've got them in the right order, etc.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here's a
And Airbird's been approved.
Not really, that's just come through.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.